Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we find ourselves stepping backward into the late 13th century, where the wind does not care about your comfort, your plans, or even your modern sense of survival. You're approaching a small stone cottage in the English countryside dated around 1273, and the air already feels like it has teeth. Snow is beginning to gather in uneven patches. The sky is turning that heavy iron colour that usually means trouble, and you're very quickly realising that you probably won't survive this night without shelter, at least not comfortably. You're standing in a world without electricity, without glass insulation, without anything remotely resembling a weather app. Just wind, stone, and instinct. The cottage ahead of you looks solid, but also strangely small against the growing storm. Somewhere in the distance. A crow calls once, then goes quiet as if even it has reconsidered being outside. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It is always oddly comforting knowing how far these little history nights travel. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You begin walking again, boots pressing into the ground that is already starting to harden. The path is not really a path anymore, just a memory of one, softened by frost and time. The cottage grows closer, its outline shaped from rough local stone, built in the year when England was under the early rule of Edward I. A king whose reign would soon become known for legal reforms and expanding royal authority. That is one of those mainstream historical facts that quietly anchors this moment. Because while you are worrying about snow, someone in this world is worrying about taxes, land rights, and feudal obligations that define who owns even the air you breathe. The wind shifts suddenly, and it feels almost intentional. Like the landscape is reminding you who is in charge here. Medieval countryside life in this era is not romantic in the way tapestries later made it look. It is survival, structured by seasons, bound to harvest cycles, and shaped by obligations to local lords. Most people living around here would recognise the cottage you are heading toward as entirely ordinary. Thick stone walls at the base, timber supports where available, and a roof that likely blends thatch and rough-hewn wood. Smoke would usually curl out of a central opening, because chimneys are still inconsistent in many rural homes at this time. A quirky little tidbit from later folklore tells of chimney smoke being read like a message from the heavens if it rose straight. Fortune was good if it twisted oddly. Illness or misfortune might be near. It sounds almost charming now, but to someone in this world, it could shape real fear before bed. And speaking of beliefs, historians still argue whether rural medieval homes were actually as cold and uncomfortable as modern imagination suggests, or whether people adapted far better than we give them credit for. You step closer to the cottage door. The snow is now falling in thicker sheets, each flake catching briefly in the fading light before vanishing into the ground. The walls of the cottage feel older the closer you get, as if they're absorbing time itself. You can hear faint sounds from inside now, maybe wood shifting, maybe a hearth struggling against damp fuel. The storm is arriving properly. You pause for a moment outside, and the wind pushes against you with a force that feels almost personal. It slides under your cloak, finds gaps in your clothing, reminds you that warmth is not guaranteed in this world. Somewhere nearby, beyond the cottage, livestock are likely being herded into tighter shelters. That is how survival works here. Humans are not alone in bracing for winter. Animals, stores, and structures all become part of the same fragile system. You finally push the door open. It creaks in a slow, heavy complaint, and the sound seems to disappear into the low ceiling of the interior. Warm air spills out. Not truly warm by modern standards, but noticeably alive compared to the biting cold outside. The interior is dim, lit mostly by a central hearth whose glow flickers across soot-darkened stones. The fire is not roaring, it is conserving itself, just like everything else in this world must. Inside, you notice how close everything is. There is no wasted space, as sleeping areas are shared. Ranged on straw pallets or raised wooden platforms, often layered with wool blankets and whatever fabric can be spared. Privacy is not really a concept here in the way you know it. Rest is communal, practical, and shaped by necessity. A tallow candle burns nearby, its faint animal fat scent mixing with smoke and damp wool. It flickers unevenly, casting long shadows that stretch and contract across the walls like slow breathing. That smell alone tells you a lot about medieval life. It is not sanitized. It is not filtered. It is real in a way modern environments rarely are. You settle near the hearth, and the warmth begins to creep into your fingers. Outside, the storm strengthens. Wind presses against the stone walls, and the sound becomes a constant low pressure, like the world itself is leaning in. A roof beam shifts slightly, releasing a soft drip of melted snow that has found its way through older thatch. You hear it and realize this cottage has weathered many winters before you arrived. In 1273, buildings like this are part of a larger rural system tied to feudal obligations. Local peasants would often owe labour or goods to a lord in exchange for protection or land use. It is a structured life, but also a constrained one. That tension between order and hardship defines the world you are standing in right now. You glance around again. The hearth is central not just physically, but socially. It is where people gather, where food is prepared, where stories are shared, and where cold is kept at bay just enough to allow sleep. Even the stone around it is blackened from years of repeated fires, layer upon layer of survival written in soot. A small draught slips through a gap in the wall, and you instinctively pull your clothing tighter. Wool scratches slightly against skin, but it is doing its job. Linen beneath it holds warmth in place. These materials are not soft in a modern sense, but they are effective, and effectiveness matters more than comfort here. Outside, the wind intensifies again, and for a moment it sounds almost like voices. Not speaking clearly, just forming shapes in the noise. Old stories in villages like this often described winter storms as spirits moving across the land. Some believed they were ancestors passing through, others thought they were warnings. It is a reminder that in this world, nature and belief are never fully separate. You lean closer to the fire, the flames shift, and the light moves across the room in slow waves. For a moment, everything feels suspended, the storm outside, the cottage interior. Your own sense of time will begin to blur slightly at the edges, and as you listen to the wind pressing against 1,273 stone, you realize the night is only just beginning. The moment you step away from the cottage in your mind, the countryside around it begins to reveal itself in a different way, as if the storm has decided to show you its true scale. You're no longer simply standing near shelter. You're inside a living winter system that stretches far beyond sight, swallowing fields, hedgerows, and distant tree lines until everything becomes a soft, shifting blankness. Snow is falling steadily now, not in gentle decoration, but in dense, purposeful sheets. It collects quickly on uneven ground, filling depressions, erasing any clear memory of where a track once might have been. The countryside of 1273 is not yet defined by paved roads or permanent infrastructure in rural areas. Instead, travel depends on footpaths worn by repeated use, narrow cart routes, an instinct passed between generations. Right now, all of that is being rewritten by weather. You imagine moving through it. Each step sinks slightly, boots pressing into a surface that resists and releases at the same time. The sound of your movement is muted, absorbed by layers of snow and wind. Even your breathing feels smaller out here, as if the cold is politely insisting you keep it to yourself. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment in the early 1270s. England is under the reign of Edward I, who had only recently taken the throne in 1272. His early rule is marked by consolidation of authority and tightening administrative systems, including record-keeping and legal reforms that would later shape land ownership across the kingdom. None of that changes the snow falling on your shoulders right now, but it defines the world that snow belongs to, a world where land, labour, and survival are deeply connected through hierarchy. The wind shifts again, and you feel how it moves differently across open space compared to the cottage walls. Out here, there is no surface to absorb it. It travels freely, carving invisible channels through the air. The countryside becomes a place of motion rather than form, with drifting snow behaving almost like water suspended in time. You notice how sound changes. There are no distant wheels, no voices, no animals calling clearly. Instead, everything is softened into ambiguity. Even your own footsteps feel uncertain, as if the ground might change its mind beneath you. This is what winter travel meant in rural medieval life. It was not just slower, it was conditional, dependent on weather, windows, and necessity rather than choice. A quirky detail from medieval rural practice appears in scattered historical records. Some communities used raised wooden markers or simple bundles of straw placed along routes to help guide travellers when snow obscured familiar paths. In some places, people also follow the faint lines of animal tracks, especially sheep or deer, trusting the animal don't feel love, girl. Well, humans did. It is a reminder that navigation here is not abstract, it is deeply physical, tied to whatever traces remain visible. You pause for a moment in the imagined snowfield, and the silence feels heavier than expected. In modern life, silence is rare. Here, it is the default state. Even storms have a kind of structure to them, a rhythm of pressure and release that replaces conversation. Far beyond your immediate surroundings, villages exist scattered through this landscape like small, persistent thoughts. Smoke would rise from chimneys if the wind allowed it. People would be inside, clustered near hearths similar to the one you just left, sharing warmth and conserving fuel. Livestock would be packed into barns or low shelters, their body heat contributing to survival in a way that feels almost communal across species. Historians still argue whether medieval rural mobility in winter was more restricted than commonly assumed. Some suggest that people adapted remarkably well, continuing travel, trade, and communication despite harsh conditions. Others argue that winter created natural pauses in movement, forcing communities into near isolation for stretches of time. The truth likely shifts depending on region, terrain, and social obligation. You continue walking, though the direction is more felt than seen. Snow gathers on your sleeves and melts slightly before refreezing at the edges, creating a thin crust that catches faint light. The sky above is a low, uniform grey, pressing down without horizon, making distance difficult to judge. Everything feels closer and farther at the same time. In this era, rural life is shaped heavily by agriculture, and that means the land is never just scenery. It is productivity, obligation, and risk. Fields that are now buried will later be ploughed and planted according to seasonal cycles that determine survival for entire communities. Winter is not an interruption. It is part of the system, a necessary pause in the agricultural rhythm. You imagine how people here would think about a storm like this, not as an event to observe from inside warm homes with insulated windows, but as something that directly affects grain stores, livestock health, and the timing of future work. Cold is not just discomfort, it is economics, labour, and planning all at once. A small, almost forgotten belief surfaces in some medieval accounts, the idea that snow carried a kind of cleansing property not only for land but for moral imbalance. Some rural communities associated heavy snowfall with the resetting of seasonal disharmony, a symbolic return to balance before spring. It was not universal, but it lingered in local interpretations of weather and fate. The wind presses harder for a moment, and you instinctively lean into it. The sensation is not painful so much as insistent. It reminds you that your body is a small object in a very large system. You begin to notice subtle variations in the landscape beneath the snow. A slight rise might indicate a buried hedge. A darker patch might be a stone outcrop or frozen soil. Everything is interpretation. Nothing is certain. In 1273, this uncertainty is normal. Maps exist, but they are limited in detail and often symbolic rather than precise. Knowledge of land is carried in memory, not in documentation. People learn routes through repetition and shared instruction, not through reference tools. That makes every journey a negotiation between memory and environment. The storm continues to deepen, and the world narrows further. What began as a countryside has become a corridor of whiteness, guiding nothing, revealing little, demanding attention with every step even though no clear destination is visible. You realize that survival here is not only about endurance, it is about interpretation, about reading the subtle language of snow, wind, and silence as if they are speaking constantly in a dialect you are only beginning to understand. And somewhere ahead, though you cannot see it yet, the cottage still waits as the only stable point in a moving world. You push the heavy wooden door fully open now, and the cottage accepts you with a low, creaking sigh, as if it has been waiting all along for the storm to deliver you here. The cold behind you tries to follow, but it is pushed back by a wall of warmer, denser air that feels almost alive. Not warm in a modern sense, not comforting in any polished way, but noticeably different. As if this interior belongs to another rule of existence entirely. You step inside, and the first thing that changes is sound. The wind outside becomes distant, flattened, reduced to a dull pressure against stone. Inside, everything is closer. Breathing, shifting wood, the soft crack of fire, the occasional drip of melting snow working its way through the roof. The cottage does not feel empty. Even if you cannot yet fully see every corner, your eyes adjust slowly. The light is low, dominated by a central hearth that sits slightly sunken into the packed earth floor. Flames flicker unevenly, fed by logs that look partially damp, producing more smoke than flame at times. The smoke does not rise neatly, it spreads, curls, and lingers before finding its way out through a roof opening that is far from perfect. A mainstream historical fact anchors this space in many English rural homes of the late 13th century. Including the period around 1273, chimneys, as we understand them, were still not universally common in peasant dwellings. Instead, open hearths were typical, and smoke escaped through roof vents or gaps in thatch, which meant interiors were often smoky by modern standards. You can feel that truth in your eyes almost immediately, a faint sting that comes not from fire itself, but from everything the fire releases into the air. Still, the cottage is not chaotic, it is organised in a way that reflects necessity. Along one wall, you notice sleeping arrangements, straw-filled pallets laid directly on wooden frames or simple raised platforms. Wool blankets are folded unevenly, some thicker than others, clearly repaired multiple times. Privacy does not exist here in the modern sense. Space is shared, rest is communal, and bodies are arranged according to practicality rather than personal separation. You move carefully, instinctively aware of how little room there is to spare. The floor beneath you is not bare earth everywhere. It is layered in places with compacted straw, already darkened by use. A quirky detail of medieval domestic life appears here. Household floors were often strewn with fresh rushes or herbs like mint and lavender, partly for insulation, partly to mask odours. and sometimes replaced so frequently that old layers would simply be swept up and discarded, occasionally even burned in the hearth itself. It is strange to think of the ground beneath your feet as something periodically refreshed like bedding, but here it is, part of the rhythm of living. You notice small objects tucked into corners, wooden bowls stacked near a wall, simple tools hanging from pegs, a rough spindle, perhaps used for spinning wool. Everything has a purpose, and nothing is purely decorative. Even what looks worn or forgotten is likely waiting for reuse. Near the hearth, you sense movement before you fully see it. Someone shifts slightly in the dim light, adjusting position closer to the warmth. The presence is not threatening, just familiar, as if your arrival is simply another part of the evening's unfolding in a household like this, especially in rural 1273 England. Boundaries between guests, family, and labourers are often fluid. People come and go according to season, need, and obligation. You crouch slightly near the fire, feeling its uneven warmth on your face. One side is almost too hot, the other still cool. The smoke shifts again, and you blink slowly, adjusting. Your eyes begin to trace the architecture more carefully. Thick stone walls form the lower structure, while timber beams support the roof above. That roof feels heavy with age, patched and repaired in places where weather has taken its toll. A faint sound draws your attention upward. Somewhere above, a small draught slips through a gap, carrying cold air that meets rising smoke. The result is a slow, swirling motion that makes the air feel almost textured. It is not clean, but it is familiar to the people who live here. You settle into a standing position that feels less like rest and more like adaptation. Your body is learning the shape of the room. You become aware of how heat gathers near the hearth and disappears quickly as you move away from it. There are invisible zones of comfort here, carefully negotiated by proximity rather than technology. A second mainstream historical fact emerges naturally in this environment. Medieval rural households often relied on shared central heating in the form of a single hearth, which served multiple purposes including cooking, heating, and light. There was no separation of systems, fire was multifunctional, and its management determined daily life. You can feel how central the idea is here. Everything orbits the hearth, even conversation would likely happen within its reach. You notice now how the smoke behaves differently depending on where you stand. Near the centre, it rises thick and slow. Near the edges of the room, it thins, replaced by a colder air that settles closer to the floor. It creates invisible layers within the cottage, zones of temperature and visibility that shape how people move and rest. Historians still argue whether medieval interior air quality in rural homes was consistently harsh, or whether people developed physiological adaptation and architectural strategies that made smoke less disruptive than modern assumptions suggest. The truth is likely complex, influenced by ventilation, fuel type, and habitual exposure. But here, in this moment, you understand that smoke is not an anomaly. It is part of the environment. You shift slightly again, and your attention catches on a faint smell beneath the smoke. Earthy, slightly sweet, almost herbal. It likely comes from those rushes on the floor, or from stored plants used for cooking or preservation. Smell here is layered, never singular. Wood, wool, ash, damp stone, and organic matter all coexist in a way that would feel overwhelming in isolation but becomes normal when lived with daily. The storm outside praises harder for a moment, and the cottage responds with a subtle creak. Stone does not bend easily, but timber does. You hear the structure adjusting, redistributing pressure, surviving in its own quiet way. Someone near the hearth shifts again, perhaps tending the fire. A small spark rises and disappears into the smoke, briefly visible like a tiny suspended moment of light. The fire is never fully controlled. It is guided, fed, negotiated with. In a world like this, fire is not a tool in the modern sense. It is a partner, sometimes cooperative, sometimes demanding attention. You begin to feel the transition happening inside you. The outside storm no longer feels like something you are actively resisting. It is now something you are enclosed beside, held at a distance by stone and shared heat. The cottage is not a refuge from nature. It is a small negotiation with it, and as you stand in the dim, smoke-softened light of 1273, you realize that this space is not just shelter. It is a living system of warmth, breath, and survival, carefully maintained against a world that is still very much outside. You remain close to the hearth, and now it becomes clear that everything in this cottage is arranged around it as if the fire is the heart and the rest of the building is simply trying to stay alive because of it. The flames shift and settle, never fully stable, sometimes bright enough to paint the stone walls in soft gold, sometimes shrinking into a low, glowing bed of embers that feels almost like breathing. Heat moves in uneven layers. You feel it strongly on your face and hands, while your back remains slightly cool, as if the cottage cannot quite decide whether to fully accept you yet. This uneven warmth is normal here. It is not a flaw. It is simply how heat behaves when it is not contained by modern materials or controlled systems. You watch someone near the fire adjust a log with a long wooden stick. The movement is slow and practiced, as if they have done this exact gesture thousands of times across winters that all feel slightly similar in memory. The fire responds immediately, a small flare of sparks rising upward before disappearing into the smoke that clings near the ceiling. The ceiling is low enough that the smoke never truly escapes in a clean way. It gathers in thin layers before slipping toward the roof opening. Your eyes sting faintly again, and you blink more slowly, adjusting without thinking. This is part of being inside a medieval interior. The air is never entirely separate from the fire that sustains it. A well-documented aspect of medieval rural housing in this period is that the hearth was not just for warmth, but also for cooking, lighting, and sometimes even basic craft work. Everything essential to daily survival was tied to this single point. You notice that reality here in the way pots hang over the fire, suspended on metal hooks or resting on stones placed carefully around the embers. There is no separation between kitchen and living space. Everything overlaps. A pot near the edge of the fire gives off a faint smell of something slowly simmering. It is not rich or refined, but it carries the deep, earthy scent of root vegetables and preserved scraps, the kind of food that stretches through long winters when nothing fresh is available. The smell mixes with smoke and damp wool, creating an atmosphere that feels dense but strangely calm. You shift your weight slightly, and the floor beneath you creaks softly. The surface is uneven, layered with compacted earth and old rushes. A lesser-known rural custom from the period involved regularly replacing these rushes, sometimes every few weeks, depending on household means. The old layers were often swept into the fire, which meant the very floor of the home eventually became part of the warmth that sustained it. There is something quietly circular about that idea, as if the cottage is constantly recycling its own lived experience. The person near the hearth hums faintly, almost absent-mindedly. It is not a song in any formal sense, more like a sound that helps mark time while waiting for food or warmth or sleep. In a world without clocks in every room, sound often becomes the measure of passing moments. You begin to notice how the firelight changes perception. Shadows stretch across the walls in slow motion, bending around beams and stone like they're alive. The cottage feels larger and smaller at the same time, depending on where you look. Near the fire, everything feels intimate and close. Away from it, corners disappear into darkness, as if the building is slowly exhaling parts of itself into shadow. A soft gust presses against the roof, and you hear the structure respond with a low, settling sound. Timber and stone together create a kind of living architecture, It does not remain perfectly still. It adjusts, flexes, and resists in ways that feel almost organic. Living here would mean learning those sounds intimately, knowing which creaks are normal and which might signal trouble. You imagine how evenings like this would pass for people who live here permanently. There would be periods of quiet work, perhaps mending clothing or preparing food, then short bursts of conversation, then silence again. Life is not divided into entertainment and rest in the modern sense. It is continuous, shaped by necessity and the availability of light and heat. A small detail from the period appears in your mind: tallow candles. Made from rendered animal fat, often used sparingly because they were smoky and not always pleasant indoors, yet they provided essential light when firelight was not enough. You notice one faintly burning nearby, its flame thin and unstable, producing a smell that is slightly sharp and unmistakably organic. It flickers whenever air moves through the room, reacting more to breath and draft than to intention. The hearth continues to dominate everything, even conversation, though you cannot fully hear it, seems to orbit around it. You catch fragments of tone rather than words, soft exchanges that rise and fall like the fire itself. There is no rush in their rhythm. Time here is not pressured. It accumulates slowly, like ash. A small observation from archaeological interpretations of rural homes suggests that soot patterns on surviving stone hearths indicate repeated, long-term use without major redesign, implying households adapted continuously to the same central fire structure across generations. This gives the impression that the fire you're watching is not just tonight's fire, but part of a much longer lineage of fires occupying the same space. Scholarly interpretations differ on indoor air quality in medieval rural homes, and whether people experienced chronic discomfort from smoke or developed practical adaptations that made daily life more tolerable than modern assumptions suggest. Either way, what you experience here is not an anomaly. It is the baseline condition of indoor life in this setting, accepted and worked around rather than eliminated. You shift closer to the warmth again, feeling the heat intensify slightly. The stone beneath the hearth reflects it unevenly, creating pockets of warmth that linger even when flames dip. You begin to understand how people would instinctively choose their positions around the fire, negotiating warmth like a shared resource. Outside, the storm continues, but it feels more distant now, as if the cottage has thickened the boundary between inside and outside. The wind still presses against the walls, but it no longer feels like it can reach you directly. Instead, it becomes background, a constant reminder that the world is still moving beyond this small enclosed space. Someone adds another piece of wood to the fire. The flames respond with a brief, brighter flare, and for a moment the entire room becomes clearer. You see the textures of stone more sharply, the grain of wood beams, the uneven edges of handmade objects. Then the light settles again, returning everything to soft shadow. You realize that the hearth is not only sustaining heat, it is shaping perception itself, controlling what can be seen, what can be felt, and even what can be ignored. In this moment, it is the center of everything, not just physically, but emotionally and structurally, anchoring the entire cottage against the winter pressing outside, and as you remain in its glow. The night continues to deepen around you, slow and steady, like breath held between storms. You settle a little deeper into the cottage now, and what begins to emerge is the quiet complexity of sleeping in a world where privacy is not a wall, but a habit. The fire continues its slow work at the center of the room, and everything around it seems arranged not for comfort in the modern sense, but for endurance through long, cold nights that do not care about individual preference. The sleeping arrangements are close enough that you can almost feel how bodies would share warmth here. Straw pallets are laid in clusters, some slightly raised on rough wooden frames, others directly on packed earth softened by a repeated use. Blankets are layered in uneven stacks, wool over linen, some patched so many times that their original colour is more memory than fact. You notice immediately that there is no separation of space in the way you would expect today. Rest is communal by necessity. Families, labourers, and sometimes travelling guests all share the same room. It is not considered unusual here. It is simply how warmth is preserved when fire and bodies are the only reliable sources of heat. A widely accepted historical understanding of medieval rural life in late 13th century England notes that shared sleeping spaces were common in peasant households, especially during winter, when conserving heat was essential. You can feel that logic embedded in every arrangement here. Nothing is wasted, not space, not warmth, not movement. You step carefully between the pallets, noticing how the floor responds with faint creaks and soft compressions. The rushes underfoot are older here, darker in colour, slightly damp from the day's moisture and the constant presence of people moving in and out. A lesser-known rural practice involved layering fresh rushes over older ones without always removing the previous layer immediately, gradually building up a soft but uneven flooring that absorbed both sound and smell. Over time, the floor became a kind of archive of daily life, compacted and renewed in cycles. Near one pallet, you notice a folded bundle of cloth that likely serves as a pillow. It is not filled with feathers or anything luxurious, but with straw or wool scraps. Even the idea of a pillow here is functional rather than indulgent. Comfort is not absent, but it is always secondary to survival. Someone shifts in their sleep nearby, and the movement is subtle but noticeable in this quiet environment. You become aware of how sound behaves differently at night in such a place. Every small motion becomes amplified by silence. A turning body, a settling beam, the faint pop of cooling wood in the hearth all register clearly. A quiet detail from archaeological studies of medieval domestic spaces suggests that sleeping areas often show repeated signs of rearrangement, indicating flexible use of space rather than fixed personal ownership. This means that where someone sleeps one night might not be where they sleep the next. Space is shared, negotiated daily rather than assigned permanently. Scholars continue to debate how medieval people psychologically experienced this lack of private sleeping space, and some argue that modern concepts of individuality make it difficult to accurately interpret their sense of comfort or discomfort. Others suggest that strong communal structures made shared rest more normal and less intrusive than it would feel today. The truth likely lies somewhere between adaptation and cultural expectation. You sit for a moment near the edge of a pallet, feeling the difference in temperature between the firelit centre and the cooler edges of the room. Heat does not distribute evenly here. It pools and fades depending on proximity and obstruction. Even the sleeping arrangements reflect this logic. The closest pallets to the hearth are likely the most desirable, especially during storms like this one. A faint scent of wool, smoke, and damp earth fills the air. It is not unpleasant in this context, but it is layered and persistent. You begin to understand how smell becomes part of memory here, how it would mark nights and seasons without need for clocks or written record. A small curious detail from the period involves the occasional use of dried herbs in sleeping areas, such as lavender or chamomile, not only for scent but also as a traditional belief in their calming properties, while not universally practiced. These additions appear in some household records and archaeological traces, suggesting an early awareness of sleep environment even within limited means. You notice now how the room subtly organises itself around the hearth even in sleep. The orientation of pallets, the placement of blankets, even the direction people lie all seem influenced by proximity to warmth. The fire is not just heat, it is orientation. It defines geography inside the cottage. The wind outside pushes harder for a moment, and the walls respond with a low, almost groaning sound. Stone holds firm, but timber adjusts. You can hear the structure breathing in its own way, absorbing pressure and redistributing it through joints and beams that have likely endured many such winters. A mainstream historical observation about this period highlights that rural English cottages often evolved slowly over generations, with incremental repairs and additions rather than complete rebuilds. This creates homes that are layered in both material and memory, where each beam or wall section may belong to a different moment in time. You feel that layered history here. Even without seeing its full timeline, you glance again at the sleeping arrangements and imagine how nights would unfold, people settling gradually, conversations fading into silence, fire tended one last time before sleep deepens. There is no clear division between day and night life here in the modern sense. It flows continuously, with rest woven into ongoing maintenance of survival. A small movement near the hearth draws your attention. Someone adjusts their position, perhaps pulling closer to warmth. The fire responds with a soft crackle, sending a brief shower of sparks upward before they vanish into smoke. The ceiling absorbs the sound almost immediately, returning the room to its low, steady hum of existence. Scholarly interpretations differ on whether medieval indoor communal sleeping was perceived as restrictive or simply practical. Some readings emphasize economic necessity, while others suggest cultural frameworks that placed less emphasis on individual separation during rest. Either way, what you see here is a system built entirely around shared endurance. You begin to feel the rhythm of the cottage more clearly now. Heat rises and falls, bodies shift and settle, wind presses and releases against stone. It is not stillness, but it is predictable in its own way. That predictability is what allows sleep to exist here at all. You lie back slightly on the edge of a pallet, not fully resting, but observing how the space holds itself together through repetition. The straw beneath you compresses softly, adjusting to weight. The wool above you carries the faint warmth of previous use, a lingering trace of shared nights, and as you remain in this dim, firelit arrangement of sleeping bodies and quiet breath, you realize that rest in this world is not an escape from life, but one of its most carefully coordinated acts. The wind outside begins to change its character as the night deepens, no longer just a steady pressure but something more rhythmic. As if the storm has developed its own pulse, inside the cottage you can hear it more clearly now through the thick stone walls, not as individual gusts but as a continuous body of sound that rises, falls, and returns again like distant breathing. You remain near the sleeping pallets, but your attention keeps drifting back to the hearth. The fire is lower now, reduced to glowing embers that cast a soft, unstable light across the room. The brightness is not gone, but it has become more intimate, as if the cottage is conserving vision the same way it conserves warmth. A mainstream historical observation about rural England in the late 13th century is that nights were structured around the maintenance of fire as much as rest. Someone would often be responsible for tending the hearth even while others slept, ensuring the embers did not die completely. You can see that responsibility here in the occasional small movement near the fire, a hand adjusting a log, a shift in posture, a quiet awareness that the flame must survive until morning. You notice how the room changes when the fire dims. Shadows grow longer, but also softer. Edges of objects become less defined, and the cottage begins to feel less like a collection of things and more like a single enclosed presence. The walls, the roof, the sleeping bodies, and at the fire all seem to belong to the same slow rhythm. A lesser-known rural practice from the period involved keeping small covered containers of embers overnight, sometimes called fire preservation methods, where glowing coals were carefully banked with ash to allow easier rekindling in the morning. This reduced the effort needed to restart a fire from scratch, which could be difficult in damp or windy conditions. You can imagine how valuable that small continuity of heat would be in a world where ignition was not guaranteed. The smell in the room shifts slightly as the fire changes state. Smoke becomes less sharp and more diffuse, mixing with the scent of damp wool and earth. There is also the faint aroma of stored food somewhere nearby, perhaps dried grains or salted meat hanging in a corner out of immediate sight. Smell here is never separate from environment. It is part of how the cottage is experienced moment to moment. You adjust your position on the pallet again, feeling the straw compress beneath you. It responds slowly, unevenly, as if remembering previous shapes. The idea of sleeping surfaces having memory is not far off here. Everything in this space has been used repeatedly, reshaped by time and bodies. Scholars continue to debate how medieval rural households structured nighttime awareness. Some interpretations suggest that even during sleep, people remain lightly attuned to their surroundings, ready to respond to changes in weather, fire, or livestock conditions. Others argue that sleep cycles were more segmented, with shorter periods of rest broken by waking intervals. What is clear is that night was not entirely unconscious in the modern sense. It was part of ongoing domestic management. You hear a soft shift near the hearth again. The person tending the fire moves slowly, almost mechanically, as if guided more by habit than active thought. The ember bed brightens slightly, a brief pulse of orange returning to the room. For a moment, the cottage feels more awake, then settles again into its dim equilibrium. Outside, the storm presses harder against the stone. The sound is deeper now, less sharp wind and more sustained force, like a heavy presence moving across the land. The walls absorb it, but do not silence it completely. Instead, they translate it into a low, continuous hum that fills the background of everything you experience. A mainstream historical fact about construction in this era is that rural cottages were often built using locally sourced materials, including fieldstone, timber, and thatch, shaped by what was available rather than standardized design. This creates homes that are deeply tied to their environment. You can feel that connection here in the way the walls seem to belong to the land itself, as if they grew out of it rather than being placed upon it. You notice small details in the firelight that you had not seen before. A crack in a beam filled with old resin, a section of wall where soot has built up in uneven patterns over years, a hanging object that might be a tool or a charm, indistinct in the low light. Each detail suggests accumulation, a slow layering of life rather than sudden change. A curious fragment of medieval rural belief involved the idea that houses could settle into sleep alongside their inhabitants, becoming quieter and more stable as night deepened, while clearly symbolic. This idea reflects how closely people associated domestic spaces with living rhythms. You begin to understand that feeling here, as the cottage seems to shift from active maintenance into something more passive and resting. You lie still for a moment, listening. The soundscape is now layered in 3 parts: the wind outside, the faint movement of fire inside, and the subtle presence of sleeping bodies. None of these dominate, they coexist, forming a balanced but fragile system of sound. The warmth near the hearth is uneven but steady. You can feel how heat radiates in pulses depending on the fire's remaining fuel. When embers brighten, warmth expands slightly. When they dim, the room tightens again into coolness. This cycle repeats slowly, almost like breathing. Historians still argue whether medieval indoor heating practices produced significant health challenges due to smoke exposure or whether long-term adaptation reduced its perceived impact. What is certain is that smoke was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a constant presence that shaped how interiors were built, used, and understood. You become more aware of your own breathing in response. It slows slightly, adjusting unconsciously to the environment. The cottage seems to encourage stillness, not through silence, but through repetition. Wind, fire, and breath all follow patterns that gradually align. A faint creak travels through the structure As timber responds to shifting pressure, it is not a sign of damage, but of flexibility. The building is alive in its own structural way, adjusting to temperature and force. You begin to recognize these sounds as part of its language. Somewhere deeper in the room, a sleeper shifts and then settles again. The movement is minimal, but it briefly disrupts the uniform stillness. Then everything returns to equilibrium. You feel time differently here. It does not move forward in clear steps. It stretches and compresses depending on sound and light. The dim glow of the hearth becomes the only consistent marker of continuity. And as you remain in this quiet, layered darkness of wind, fire, and shared sleep, the cottage continues its slow negotiation with the storm outside, holding its small circle of warmth intact against the vast winter pressing in. The storm outside has fully settled into its nighttime rhythm now, no longer surprising or erratic, but steady and persistent, as if the entire countryside has agreed to endure it together, inside the cottage. That rhythm becomes something you stop resisting and start listening to, like a language spoken through pressure, wood, and stone. You remain among the sleeping forms in dim firelight, but your awareness begins to drift outward, beyond the walls, into the wider world that this cottage belongs to. It is easy to forget, in this enclosed warmth, that the land outside is part of a much larger system of villages, fields, obligations, and seasonal survival that defines life in 1273 England. A well-attested feature of rural society in this period is the deep connection between land use and feudal responsibility. Most people living in countryside cottages like this one are tied to obligations that shape their labour throughout the year, from planting and harvest to maintenance of common resources. That structure is not abstract here. It determines what food exists in storage, how much fuel is gathered, and even how much time can be spent indoors during winter. You imagine the surrounding fields now buried under snow. In another season, they would be divided into strips, worked collectively by villagers whose lives are carefully synchronized with agricultural cycles. Right now, those same fields are silent, hidden, and temporarily irrelevant, yet still quietly determining survival inside this cottage through stored grain and preserved supplies. A lesser-known rural belief from the medieval countryside holds that deep winter storms carried the memory of the land, meaning that snow was seen not just as weather, but as a kind of covering that preserved the past year's efforts until spring returned to reveal whether the land had been generous or harsh. It is a poetic interpretation of something very practical, the way winter delays judgment on agricultural success. Inside, the fire pulses again slightly, and the room brightens for a moment. You notice how light changes perception of everything. Objects that were nearly invisible moments ago reappear with texture and definition. Then, as the fire settles, they fade back into shadow. This constant shifting makes the cottage feel less like a fixed space and more like a breathing environment. Breathing. A documented aspect of medieval domestic architecture is the absence of strict separation between work, rest, and living spaces in rural homes. Everything happens in proximity. Cooking, sleeping, preparing, tools, and social interaction all occur within overlapping zones around the hearth. You begin to see how this creates a different sense of time. There is no clean division between activities. Life flows continuously through the same space. Some researchers suggest that this spatial overlap may have influenced how people perceive daily routine, making time feel more cyclical and less segmented than in modern environments. Others argue that it was simply a matter of efficiency under material constraints. Either way, the effect is the same. The cottage does not organize life into rooms. It organizes life into heat, light, and distance from fire. You shift slightly on the pallet again, and the straw beneath you compresses with a soft rustle. That sound is small, but noticeable in the quiet. Around you, other sleepers remain still. Their presence felt more than seen. Breathing becomes part of the room's rhythm, indistinguishable from wind or fire at times. A curious rural belief, recorded in scattered regional accounts, describes winter nights as times when the boundary between the inside breath and outside breath of the world becomes thinner. It is not a formal doctrine, but a way of describing how closely people felt connected to the environment during extreme cold. You can sense the idea in the way the wind outside seems to press against your own breathing patterns. The cottage responds again with a low creak as wind pressure shifts. Timber flexes slightly, stone remains firm, and the whole structure adjusts in small increments that are barely noticeable unless you are listening closely. It is easy to imagine how familiar these sounds would become to someone who lived here permanently, like a nightly conversation between house and weather. You glance toward the hearth again. The embers are dimmer now, glowing in scattered pockets of orange and red. The person tending the fire earlier seems to have settled, leaving the hearth in a controlled low state rather than full flame. This is intentional. Fire must be balanced carefully to last through the night without consuming all available fuel too quickly. A well-documented feature of medieval rural households is the practice of conserving fuel during winter months, especially in regions where wood collection was limited by weather or land access. Fire management becomes a form of planning, not just maintenance. You can feel that discipline in the restrained glow of the hearth. The air inside the cottage feels heavier now, not in an oppressive way, but in a layered sense. Smoke, warmth, breath, and damp wool all occupy the same space. It is not clean air, but it is inhabited air, shaped by the continuous human presence. A fragment of folklore from the period suggests that homes which endured many winters gained a kind of memory warmth, meaning that the building itself was thought to retain heat more effectively after long use. While not physically accurate in a modern scientific sense, it reflects the intuitive understanding that lived-in spaces feel warmer, not only because of heat sources, but because of accumulated occupancy. You begin to feel that idea here. The cottage does not feel new or temporary, it feels practiced, as if it has learned how to survive winter alongside its inhabitants. Scholarly interpretation differs on how medieval rural communities balanced individual comfort with collective necessity. Some argue that shared living arrangements reduced personal comfort in favour of survival efficiency. Others suggest that communal structures created their own form of emotional security, where proximity itself provided reassurance. What remains clear is that isolation, in the modern sense, was not the default condition here. You hear a faint sound again, a sleeper shifting deeper into rest. The movement is minimal, but it briefly ripples through the stillness like a soft disturbance in water. Then everything settles again. Outside, the storm continues without change, but your perception of it has shifted. It is no longer something pressing against you directly. It is something filtered through layers of stone, fire, and shared breath. The cottage has become a kind of intermediary between human life and winter itself. You feel the rhythm of the night more clearly now, fire fading and returning, wind pressing and releasing, bodies resting and adjusting. None of it is static, but all of it is stable in its repetition. And as you remain in this dim, fire-softened interior shaped by centuries of winter survival, the cottage holds its quiet balance against the storm, continuing its slow, steady dialogue with the night. The night inside the cottage has settled into a slower rhythm now, as if even the storm outside has been partially absorbed into the walls and redistributed as distant sound. The fire is lower again, but still alive, still holding the centre of the room together with its soft, wavering glow. Shadows stretch and shrink across the stone like they are breathing in response to it. You shift your attention away from the sleeping figures on the hearth, letting your awareness drift toward the edges of the room where storage and survival quietly define the shape of daily life. In a place like this, nothing is more important than what can be kept for later. Winter is not just a season, it is a long negotiation with absence. Along one wall, you begin to notice what at first looks like ordinary clutter, but gradually resolves into carefully arranged provisions. There are bundles wrapped in cloth, wooden containers with tight lids, and hanging hooks from which darker shapes are suspended. The air here is different, heavier, slightly richer in smell, carrying the faint saltiness of preserved food. A well-documented aspect of rural medieval life in late 13th century England is the reliance on preservation methods such as salting, drying, and smoking to ensure food availability through winter months. Freshness is not the goal, survival is. You can see that philosophy in every item stored here, each one prepared not for immediate enjoyment but for endurance over time. You step closer to the storage area, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm of the cottage. Hanging from a beam are strips of cured meat, darkened by smoke and age, their surfaces uneven but solid. Nearby, sacks likely contain dried grains such as barley or oats, staples that would be ground into coarse meal for porridge or simple bread. Nothing here is refined. Everything is stretched as far as possible. On the ground, you notice wooden barrels sealed with rough stoppers. These would likely hold salted vegetables, perhaps cabbage or turnips preserved in brine. A lesser-known rural practice from the period involved burying root vegetables in shallow pits lined with straw to protect them from freezing, allowing them to remain edible deep into winter. It's a method that relies on the earth itself as a kind of natural refrigerator, using cold rather than resisting it. The smell near these stores is distinct, earthy, slightly sharp, with a faint undertone of salt and smoke. It is not unpleasant, but it is dense, layered with the memory of preparation. You can almost sense the effort behind each item, the labour of harvest, curing, and storage compressed into these quiet forms. A mainstream historical understanding of medieval rural economy highlights that food preservation was not optional, but essential, especially in agrarian communities tied to feudal systems where surplus had to be carefully managed and portioned across seasons. The rhythm of abundance and scarcity shaped every decision, from slaughtering livestock at specific times of year to rationing grain supplies through winter. You imagine how carefully these stores would be monitored. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. Every container here represents planning against uncertainty. In a world without long-distance supply chains, what exists inside this room is the boundary between stability and hunger. A curious fragment of rural belief from the period suggests that properly salted food was thought not only to resist decay, but to carry a kind of strength of memory, meaning it retained the essence of summer or harvest longer than fresh food could. While not scientific, it reflects an intuitive understanding of preservation as transformation rather than simple storage. You run your gaze along the wall again. Some bundles are tied with rough twine, possibly containing herbs or dried plants used for seasoning or medicine. Even these are functional. Flavour and healing are often indistinguishable in this period. The same plants that season food may also soothe illness or preserve other ingredients. Outside, the storm shifts slightly and the sound filters through the stone as a low, continuous pressure. It feels distant now, almost separate from the interior world. The cottage has become a sealed system of heat, breath, and stored survival. You notice how storage and living space are not separated here. Food exists in the same room as sleep and fire. There is no hidden pantry far away. Everything is present, visible, and integrated into daily life. This proximity reinforces awareness of scarcity. You're always aware of what you have and what remains. Scholarly interpretation differs on how medieval rural diets were experienced nutritionally. Some researchers suggest that despite limited variety, seasonal adaptation and preservation techniques provided sufficient sustenance for most populations. Others argue that long winters and dependency on stored goods led to periods of nutritional stress, especially when harvests failed or storage conditions deteriorated. The truth likely varies significantly depending on region and year. You crouch slightly near one of the barrels, noticing faint markings carved into the wood. These might indicate ownership, contents, or simply serve as practical identifiers in a household where literacy is not universal. Marks like these function as memory aids, externalizing information that would otherwise need to be held collectively. A well-attested feature of the period is that households often relied on shared knowledge systems rather than written records for managing food stores. Everyone in the household would know what was stored, where it was kept, and how it should be rationed. Memory itself becomes part of infrastructure. You can feel how this system shapes behavior. Even movement in the cottage feels mindful. Nothing is accidental. Every reach, every opening of a container, every portion taken carries weight because it directly connects to future survival. The fire crackles softly again, drawing your attention back toward the center of the room. Its glow reflects faintly off the edges of stored containers, creating a subtle contrast between warmth and preservation. One is active, consuming fuel, the other is static, resisting time. Both are essential. You imagine how these stores would gradually diminish over the winter months, each meal slightly reducing what remains, each careful ration extending survival just a little further. Winter here is not a single event, it is a slow consumption of stored effort. A lesser-known rural practice involved mixing certain grains with dried legumes to stretch supplies further while maintaining some nutritional balance. These mixtures would be coarse and repetitive in texture, but they represented careful planning rather than luxury. Food here is engineered for duration, not variety. Outside, wind presses again against the cottage, but it feels more like background noise now than a direct presence. Inside. The world is defined by what is already secured rather than what is coming. You rise slowly from the storage area and return your attention toward the hearth. The contrast is immediate. Firelight feels dynamic again after the stillness of stored goods. One represents present warmth, the other represents future survival. And as you stand between these two systems of medieval life, the living fire and the silent provisions, you begin to understand how every winter in this world is not endured moment by moment, but calculated in advance, stored in wood, salt, grain, and memory. You return toward the warmth of the hearth, but something has subtly changed in how you experience it now, after seeing the storage. The fire no longer feels like an isolated comfort. It feels like part of a larger system, one that transforms raw survival into something temporarily livable. Heat here is not just sensation, it is the result of careful planning, labour, and preservation all working together against the season outside. The fire is lower again, but still steady. Its glow is softer now, spreading across the room in uneven waves that make the stone walls look almost fluid. Shadows lean and shift with each small movement of flame, and the cottage feels less like a fixed structure and more like something gently breathing in darkness. You notice how people in the room adjust unconsciously to the fire's presence. No one speaks loudly. Movements are economical. Even sleep seems structured around the hearth's influence. This is not silence imposed by rule. It is silence shaped by environment. A well-attested feature of rural domestic life in late 13th century England is the centrality of shared heat in organising household behaviour during winter months. Fire dictates where people sit, how they rest, and even how long they remain awake. You can feel that hierarchy here without anyone needing to state it aloud. The closer you are to the hearth, the more present you are in the life of the room. You settle again near the edge of a pallet, watching how embers shift and collapse into each other. The fire is no longer dramatic. It is contemplative. Small pockets of orange glow flare briefly before dimming again, as if the cottage is slowly exhaling heat into the night. A lesser-known rural custom recorded in regional accounts describes the practice of night-watching the fire, where one person would remain lightly awake or semi-aware to ensure embers did not die out completely. This role was not formalized in every household, but it reflects the importance of continuity in environments where restarting fire could be difficult, especially during damp or windy winter conditions. You can imagine how that responsibility would feel, not urgent in the moment, but constant in the background of awareness. A fire is never just burning. It is always being maintained, even in rest. Outside, the storm has not lessened. Instead, it has become more uniform, like a steady pressure applied to all sides of the cottage at once. The sound is no longer chaotic, it is consistent, almost rhythmic, as if the weather has settled into endurance just as the people inside have. A mainstream historical understanding of medieval rural construction highlights that cottages were often designed with thick walls of stone or wattle and daub specifically to buffer against seasonal extremes. These materials do not eliminate cold or wind, but they slow it, transform it, and delay its entry. You feel that delay now as a kind of softened boundary between inside and outside worlds. You shift slightly again, and the straw beneath the pallet responds with a soft rustle. That sound seems small, but in the quiet of the room it becomes part of the overall texture of night. Everything contributes to the soundscape here, no matter how minor. A curious rural belief from the period suggests that the hearth was considered a kind of domestic anchor, not only physically but spiritually, representing continuity of household identity. While not a formal doctrine, it reflects how closely fire was tied to the idea of stability. A house without a fire was not simply cold, it was unfinished, unsettled, incomplete. You watch the embers pulse again. There is a faint moment where they brighten without fresh fuel, just shifting internally as ash settles and oxygen finds new paths. It is a reminder that even within stillness, there is motion. Scholarly interpretation differs on how medieval households perceived nighttime quiet. Some suggest that darkness and silence were accepted as natural extensions of daily rhythm, rather than conditions to be avoided. Others argue that they required active management through light, conversation, or shared tasks to prevent anxiety or disorientation. Both interpretations likely coexist depending on household and circumstance. You notice now how your own awareness adjusts to the fire's rhythm. When it brightens, attention sharpens. When it dims, thoughts slow. The hearth is not just lighting the room, it is pacing perception. A well-documented aspect of medieval fuel use is the reliance on wood gathered from nearby woodland or communal areas, often carefully regulated to prevent overuse. This means every log in the fire carries a kind of embedded labour. From collection to transport to storage, you begin to see each small flame as the visible result of a long chain of effort. You glance around the cottage again. Sleeping forms remain still, though not entirely motionless. Occasional shifts, subtle adjustments, the quiet evidence of bodies negotiating comfort in imperfect conditions. The room never fully stops moving, it only slows. A lesser-known fragment of folklore from the medieval countryside describes winter nights as times when the house listens back, meaning that people believed structures absorbed the sounds and energies of those inside them. It is a poetic way of describing familiarity, but also suggests how closely people identified their homes with living presence. The timber beams above creak softly again, responding to temperature changes as heat rises and cold presses from outside. You start to recognize patterns in these sounds, not as random noise but as predictable reactions. The cottage has its own language of adjustment. You lie back slightly, feeling the uneven surface of straw and cloth beneath you. It is not soft in a modern sense, but it is structured in layers that distribute weight and warmth. Comfort here is not a single quality. It is an arrangement of compromises. A mainstream historical observation about rural medieval households is that bedding materials were often reused and repaired extensively, with textiles representing significant household value. Nothing in this space is disposable in the modern sense. Everything is extended through use, mending, and adaptation. You become aware of how still the room has become, not empty, but stabilized. The fire, the seakeepers, the wind outside all have reached a temporary balance. It is not peace exactly, it is equilibrium. Outside, the storm continues its slow movement across the countryside, but here inside the cottage, its presence is filtered into distance. It exists, but it does not dominate. You focus again on the fire. The embers are smaller now, clustered closer together. Their glow is faint but persistent, like memory that refuses to fully fade. This persistence becomes the center of everything in the room, and as you remain in this dim, fire-shaped quiet, you realize that the entire cottage is built not to escape winter, but to compress it into something small enough to be endured. The cottage has now fully settled into the deepest part of the night, where time feels less like something moving forward and more like something suspended in layers of warmth, breath, and fading firelight. You remain close to the hearth, but your awareness begins to drift outward again, not towards storage or sleep, but toward the unseen world that surrounds this small structure in 1273. Outside, the storm continues with steady persistence, is no longer dramatic in its presence, but continuous, like a long exhale that never quite ends. The sound reaches you only as a filtered version of itself, softened by stone walls and thick thatch. It becomes part of the background rhythm of existence inside the cottage, indistinguishable at times from the fire's own quiet crackle. You notice how the fire has changed again. It is now reduced to a concentrated bed of embers, glowing in irregular clusters that pulse faintly when air moves across them. The light they give is not strong, but it is enough to define the room in soft gradients. Edges blur, distances feel uncertain. Everything exists in relation to warmth rather than space. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural domestic life is the dependence on embers rather than continuous flame during long winter nights. Fire was often carefully managed to preserve heat without exhausting limited fuel supplies. What you are seeing here is that principle in practice. The hearth is no longer actively consuming large logs. It is maintaining continuity through minimal energy, stretching warmth across hours of darkness. You shift slightly on the straw pallet again, and the movement produces a soft, dry rustle that seems almost amplified in the quiet. Around you, sleepers remain still, though not entirely motionless. The smallest adjustments ripple through the room like faint disturbances in water, quickly settling back into silence. A lesser-known rural practice described in regional accounts involves the idea of listening to the house at night, where inhabitants would become attuned to subtle structural sounds as part of daily awareness. Timber settling, wind pressure on walls, and the faint shifting of thatch were not considered interruptions but familiar signals of a living environment responding to weather and temperature. You begin to recognize those signals more clearly now. The cottage is not static. It is constantly adjusting in small increments, responding to external pressure with internal movement. A beam creaks softly, then settles. A section of roof releases a faint shift of snow weight. The structure behaves like something quietly negotiating its own stability. The air inside feels heavier than earlier, not oppressive but layered. Smoke, breath, damp wool, and stored earthiness from provisions all coexist in a single atmosphere that has been shaped by hours of shared presence. There is no separation between air and activity. Everything contributes to it. You glance toward the hearth again. The embers have dimmed further, now appearing as scattered points of low orange light embedded in ash. Occasionally, one brightens briefly as hidden heat finds oxygen, then fades again. This slow cycle gives the impression of something still alive, but resting. Records from the period suggest that maintaining embers overnight was not only practical, but essential in many rural households, especially during winter months when ignition methods were unreliable. The continuity of fire meant continuity of life. Cooking, warmth, and light. Losing it entirely would have meant additional labour in difficult conditions. You imagine the effort required to restart a fire from cold ash in this weather. Damp wood, limited tinder, wind pushing through gaps. Even simple tasks would become complicated under these conditions. That makes the faint glow in front of you feel more significant. It is not just light, it is continuity preserved. A curious rural belief from medieval countryside traditions describes embers as carrying the memory of the day. A poetic way of expressing how fire was thought to retain traces of past activity. While symbolic rather than literal, it reflects how closely people associated hearth fire with the rhythm of daily life. You feel that idea in a different way now. The fire is not just warmth. It is a record of everything that has happened in this room since evening began. Every added log, every shift of air, every moment of gathering and settling is still present in the form of heat and ash. Outside, the storm continues without change, but your perception of it has shifted again. It no longer feels like something separate pressing in. It feels like something expected, almost routine. Part of the seasonal structure of existence rather than an interruption of it. Interpretations of medieval rural experience vary among researchers when it comes to nighttime awareness and sensory adaptation. Some suggest that prolonged exposure to low light, smoke, and natural sound patterns may have led to heightened sensitivity to environmental cues. Others emphasize cultural familiarity, arguing that what seems intense or unfamiliar now would have been routine and unremarkable to those living within it. Either way, you begin to notice more subtle details, the faint difference in temperature between floor levels, the way air moves when someone shifts in sleep, the slight variation in sound when wind direction changes outside. None of these are dramatic, but together they form a complete picture of the night. You adjust your position again, this time more slowly, as if matching the pace of the environment around you. The straw compresses gently beneath you, reshaping itself without resistance. Bedding here is not designed for comfort in isolation, but for adaptation over time. It conforms through repeated use rather than engineered softness. A lesser-known domestic practice from the period involved rotating sleeping positions near the hearth depending on temperature, hierarchy, or necessity. Closer positions to the fire were often reserved for those with greater need or status within the household, especially during severe weather. This created a subtle geography of warmth that shifted nightly depending on conditions. You notice how even here, warmth is distributed according to structure rather than equality. The cottage organizes comfort in gradients, not absolutes. The fire dims slightly again, then stabilizes. Its glow is now faint but persistent, almost like a signal that refuses to fully disappear. The room responds by becoming darker, but not colder. Heat lingers in materials even when flame weakens. Absorbed into stone, wood, and fabric, you feel that lingering warmth around you, not as a single source but as a distributed memory of heat held within the structure itself. The cottage is not actively warming you now. It is retaining what has already been given, and as you remain in this layered quiet of ember light, shifting wind, and shared sleep, the night continues its slow passage held gently within stone and smoke, as if the entire world has narrowed down to this single, breathing shelter. The cottage has now entered a deeper kind of stillness, the sort that only appears when firelight is reduced to memory, and the storm outside becomes less of an event and more of a continuous condition. You are no longer observing the night as something unfolding. You are inside it, folded into its rhythm. sharing space with every sound the structure decides to keep. The embers glow faintly, clustered low in the hearth like scattered stars that have fallen into ash. Their light is not enough to define the room clearly anymore, but it is enough to prevent it from dissolving entirely into darkness. Everything is suggested rather than revealed. Shapes exist in partial certainty. Edges are felt more than seen. You remain still for a moment, and in that stillness, you begin to notice how the cottage organises itself without active effort. Heat is no longer being produced in large amounts, but it is still present in materials. Stored in stone walls, absorbed into timber, held in woven cloth and straw bedding, it is a distributed warmth, slowly fading but not gone. A well-recorded aspect of rural domestic life in late medieval England is the reliance on thermal retention rather than continuous heating. Buildings were designed and lived in a way that allowed heat to accumulate and linger, especially through shared occupancy. The cottage is doing exactly that now. It is holding on to what the fire has already given it. You shift slightly on the pallet, and the movement feels louder than expected in the quiet. The straw compresses with a dry, soft sound that immediately dissolves into the stillness again. Around you, the sleepers remain in varied states of rest, some fully still, others subtly adjusting in ways that suggest light sleep rather than deep unconsciousness. A less-known rural custom described in some regional accounts involved what could be called segmented rest, where sleep was not always continuous but occurred in phases across the night. People would sleep, wake briefly, tend to animals or fire, then return to rest. It was not structured in a modern sense, but shaped by necessity and environment. You can sense that logic in the atmosphere here. The night does not feel like a single block of time. It feels layered, as if it contains smaller intervals of awareness and rest nested within it, outside. The wind presses again against the cottage, but more gently now, as though it too is tiring. The sound is less sharp and more continuous, blending into a low, almost ocean-like pressure. The walls absorb it and translate it into a faint vibration that you feel more than hear. A mainstream understanding of medieval rural construction emphasizes that thick stone bases and timber frameworks were used not only for durability, but also for insulation against seasonal extremes. These materials do not stop the cold entirely, but they delay it, soften it, and spread it out over time. You experience that delay as a kind of buffer between yourself and the storm. The fire shifts slightly, and one small ember brightens unexpectedly, producing a brief flicker of orange light that travels across nearby surfaces before fading again. That moment of brightness changes the room's perception for an instant. Objects reappear with texture. Then darkness reclaims them gently. You begin to realize how dependent perception is on this small, unstable source. Without it, the cottage would still exist, but it would become indistinct, almost conceptual. Light here is not just illumination, it is definition. A curious rural belief preserved in scattered accounts suggests that hearth embers were sometimes thought to guide the house through the night, as if the fire retained a protective awareness even when reduced to its smallest form. While symbolic, it reflects how closely people associated fire with continuity and safety. You breathe more slowly now, not intentionally but in response to the environment. The air is heavier than earlier, shaped by hours of shared presence. Smoke is faint but persistent, mixed with the smell of wool, damp wood, and stored provisions. It is not unpleasant, it is simply complete. Interpretations of medieval domestic life vary among researchers when it comes to sensory adaptation. Some suggest that long-term exposure to smoke and low light conditions would have made inhabitants more attuned to subtle environmental changes. Others argue that cultural familiarity played a larger role, and that what seems challenging now was simply normalized through constant experience. Either way, you find yourself noticing details that would normally be ignored. the slight variation in temperature near different parts of the pallet, the way air moves when someone shifts position across the room, the softest creak of timber responding to cooling temperatures. Each of these becomes part of a larger, coherent pattern. You turn your head slightly toward the hearth. The embers are now extremely low, barely more than a faint internal glow embedded in ash. Yet they persist. That persistence feels significant in a way that is difficult to articulate. It is not brightness that matters here. It is continuity. A well-documented aspect of fuel management in medieval household involved careful banking of embers overnight to preserve heat and reduce the labour of relighting fires in the morning. This practice was essential in environments where ignition materials were limited and weather conditions often made fire starting difficult. You can imagine how that would shape nightly behaviour. Fire is not simply used and extinguished. It is maintained across time, treated as something that must survive the night alongside the people it warms. The cottage creaks softly again as wind pressure shifts outside. The sound is not alarming, it is familiar. Almost reassuring in its repetition, the structure is constantly adjusting, redistributing force through balanced beams that have likely endured many winters before this one. A lesser-known fragment of folklore from rural communities describes houses as having winter bones, referring to the way buildings seem to stiffen and settle during colder months. It is a poetic way of describing structural response to temperature changes, but it also reflects how closely people observe the behaviour of their homes. You feel that idea in the subtle movement of the space. The cottage is not passive, it responds, it shifts slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed if you are paying attention. Around you, the sleeping figures remain mostly still, though not frozen. The small variations in posture suggest ongoing cycles of comfort adjustment. Sleep here is not rigid, it is fluid, shaped by temperature, sound, and proximity to warmth. You settle again into your own position, feeling the straw beneath you adjust slowly to your weight. It is not a soft surface in the modern sense, but it is responsive. It conforms through time rather than design. The firelight is now so faint that it barely paints the walls, yet it continues to influence perception. Even minimal light here has disproportionate effect. It defines orientation. It determines what feels near or far. Without it, spatial understanding would collapse into uncertainty. And as you remain in this dim, ember-held quiet, where fire, wind, and breath share the same softened rhythm, the cottage continues its slow endurance through the night, carrying warmth forward in fragments until morning. The night has now reached its most unmarked stretch, where time feels less like something you pass through and more like something that simply exists around you. The cottage is quiet in a way that is not absence of sound, but a careful balancing of many small sounds that refuse to become anything larger. The hearth is barely alive now. A few embers remain, glowing in scattered clusters like distant points of memory. Their light is so faint that it no longer shapes the room strongly, but it still prevents total darkness from settling in. That small persistence is enough to hold everything together. You lie still on the pallet, and your awareness begins to widen in a slow, unfocused way. The boundary between your body and the room feels less distinct. Heat is no longer something you are simply receiving. It is something you are sharing with the structure itself, absorbed into straw, wood, and stone, then slowly returned. A well-documented aspect of rural domestic architecture in late medieval England is the gradual heat retention of enclosed spaces occupied continuously through the night. Even when fire output decreases, the combined warmth of bodies and materials sustains a moderated internal temperature. You can feel that principle now as a soft equilibrium that has formed between all elements inside the cottage. The wind outside continues, but its intensity feels less threatening than earlier. It is still present, still pressing against the structure, but it no longer feels like an interruption. Instead, it becomes part of the background rhythm, a continuous force that defines contrast rather than disruption. You notice how the cottage seems to hold itself differently at this hour. The earlier tension in the beams and walls has softened into a steady state. Timber creaks are fewer, and when they do occur, they feel more like settling than resistance. The structure appears to have fully adapted to the weight of the storm. A lesser-known rural observation recorded in some regional accounts describes how nighttime houses were thought to learn the storm as it continued, gradually adjusting their internal responses to wind pressure and temperature changes. While metaphorical, it reflects how closely people listen to the behaviour of their homes during long winter nights. You shift slightly, and the straw beneath you responds with a muted rustle. That sound fades quickly into silence, absorbed by the density of the room around you. The other sleepers remain in varied states of rest. Some are fully still, while others show faint signs of lighter sleep. Small adjustments of limbs or breath that indicate ongoing awareness at the edge of unconsciousness. Sleep here does not appear as a single uniform state. It seems layered, as if awareness fades in stages rather than disappearing entirely. That impression aligns with some interpretations of medieval sleep patterns that suggest segmented rest cycles influenced by environmental conditions and household demands. You breathe more slowly now without intending to. The air is cooler near the floor, warmer closer to the hearth's remnants. This gradient is subtle but noticeable when you remain still long enough to perceive it. It creates invisible zones within the cottage, shaping where comfort naturally gathers. A mainstream historical understanding of medieval rural interiors emphasizes that smoke, while present, was often managed through ventilation gaps in roofs or walls, rather than fully enclosed chimneys in many homes of this period. The result was a constant but diluted presence of smoke that became part of the ambient environment rather than a temporary byproduct of fire. You can sense that lingering presence now. It is not sharp or irritating anymore. It is simply part of the air, woven into everything else. Wool, wood, ash, breath, and stored food all coexist within the same atmospheric layer. The embers flicker faintly again, not because they are being fed, but because small shifts in airflow allow remaining heat to surface briefly before fading. These tiny fluctuations create the illusion of life continuing at the centre of the hearth even as it declines into near darkness. A curious rural belief from medieval tradition suggests that embers left overnight were thought to carry protective qualities, ensuring the household remained safe until morning, while not grounded in physical reality. It highlights the symbolic importance of continuity in domestic fire practices. You begin to understand why that symbolism would arise naturally. Even the faintest glow feels like reassurance. It signals that the system of survival is still intact, even in reduced form. Outside, the storm continues its steady presence, but it now feels distant in a different way than before, not because it has weakened, but because your perception of it has adjusted. It is no longer a separate force pressing against the cottage. It is part of the larger environment in which the cottage simply exists. Interpretations of medieval rural experience vary among researchers when it comes to sensory thresholds during extended winter conditions. Some suggest that inhabitants became highly sensitive to environmental changes due to constant exposure, while others argue that familiarity reduced perceived intensity over time. Both views acknowledge that perception itself is shaped by sustained living conditions. You notice this shift in yourself. Sounds that once felt significant now blend into background layers. The wind, the faint creak of timber, the distant settling of the roof, all combine into a single continuous presence rather than separate events. The cottage feels more unified now. Earlier divisions between storage, sleeping, and hearth have softened into a single integrated space defined by shared warmth and diminishing light. Everything within it contributes to the same slow process of holding heat through the night. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural life is the importance of shared occupancy, in maintaining internal warmth during cold seasons. Individual comfort was often secondary to collective survival, with bodies acting as part of the heating system itself. You can feel that principle embodied in the way the room retains warmth despite the fire's decline. You shift your position again, and the pallet adjusts beneath you. The sensation is mild but noticeable. Straw compresses and reshapes slowly, reflecting repeated use over time. Bedding materials here are not static. They evolve through accumulation and pressure. The embers dim further, now barely distinguishable from surrounding ash except for occasional faint pulses of orange. Each pulse feels like a final attempt at visibility before settling back into darkness. A lesser-known fragment of rural folklore describes the final embers of a hearth as sleeping fire, a poetic expression that frames the fire not as extinguished, but as resting. This language reflects the tendency to interpret domestic elements as living participants in household life. You remain still, listening. The soundscape has narrowed to its simplest form. Wind outside, occasional structural adjustment, soft breathing nearby, the fire's minimal presence. These elements form a stable pattern that no longer feels fragmented. You begin to sense how the cottage itself participates in this stability. It is not merely sheltering activity, it is organizing it, holding all these elements within a controlled environment shaped by material limits and environmental pressure. And as you remain in this dim, slowly settling quiet where fire, breath, and storm have reached a temporary balance, the cottage continues its quiet endurance through the deepest part of the night, carrying warmth forward in the smallest possible fragments. The cottage has now entered a quieter phase of the night, where even the smallest sounds feel stretched and softened, as if the world outside has slowed its breathing to match the rhythm inside. The fire is almost entirely reduced to a faint scatter of embers, glowing intermittently beneath a thin layer of ash. It no longer illuminates the room in any strong sense, but it continues to define it in the most minimal way possible. You remain lying on the pallet, and your awareness feels unusually open, as though the boundaries between sleep, thought, and observation have become less distinct. The cottage is no longer something you are actively interpreting. It is something you are simply existing within. Outside, the storm has not changed in intensity, but it has changed in character. The wind is steadier now, less abrupt, more uniform, like a continuous pressure applied across the landscape. The sound reaches you through thick stone and thatch as a distant, low presence that no longer demands attention but still shapes the atmosphere. Inside, the air carries a layered density. Smoke, even at this reduced fire level, remains present in faint traces, mixed with the smell of damp wool, straw, and stored provisions. It is not overwhelming, it is simply total. Everything contributes to it. Nothing exists in isolation. You notice how the cottage seems to hold warmth in a distributed way now. The fire is no longer actively producing it in large amounts, yet the heat remains embedded in the structure itself. Stone retains it slowly, timber releases it gradually, and even the bedding beneath you seems to carry traces of earlier warmth. This is not a single source of heat anymore. It's a shared memory spread across materials. Archaeological studies of rural domestic structures from this period indicate that heat retention in small stone and timber buildings played a significant role in nighttime comfort, particularly in winter months. Even after fires diminished, internal temperatures could remain moderately stable due to insulation, body heat, and limited air exchange. You can feel that principle at work here. Not as theory, but as lived experience. You shift slightly, and the straw beneath you responds with a soft, dry sound. It is subtle, but in the quiet of the room it feels significant. Around you, other sleepers remain in varied states of rest. Some are deeply still, while others exhibit faint movements that suggest lighter sleep phases, brief adjustments, or partial awareness of their surroundings. Sleep here does not feel like a complete departure from the environment. It feels integrated into it. The cottage does not separate rest from presence. It holds both simultaneously. A lesser-known rural practice recorded in regional accounts describes how households sometimes relied on ambient sounds to gauge the passage of night. The shifting of wind, the settling of beams, or the faint changes in fire sound would serve as informal markers of time when no artificial lighting or mechanical clocks were available. You begin to understand how those subtle cues could become deeply familiar. The embers shift again slightly, producing a brief flicker that momentarily outlines nearby objects in a soft, unstable glow. For an instant, the room becomes more defined, then fades back into shadow. That fluctuation gives the space a rhythm that feels almost like breathing, though slower and more irregular. There is a quiet sense that the cottage is now in its most stable state of the night. Not active, not alert, but balanced. Everything is settled into positions that require minimal adjustment. Wind presses and releases, but does not disrupt. Fire diminishes, but does not vanish. Sleep deepens, but does not fully isolate. Interpretations of medieval rural life vary when it comes to nocturnal awareness. Some analyses suggest that people remained partially alert through the night due to environmental demands such as livestock care or fire maintenance. Other perspectives emphasize cultural normalization of fragmented rest, where waking and sleeping were interwoven rather than strictly separated states. What is clear is that night was not a singular block of unconsciousness. You experience that ambiguity now. There is a sense of awareness that is not fully active, but not absent either. It hovers at the edge of perception, responding occasionally to sound or movement without fully engaging. Outside, the storm continues its long passage, but it feels less directional now. It is no longer something moving toward or away from you. It is simply present across the landscape, like atmospheric condition that defines the entire region equally. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural construction is the reliance on heavy, locally sourced materials that respond slowly to environmental change. Stone walls do not react immediately to wind or temperature shifts. Instead, they absorb and distribute those forces over time. You feel that delayed response in the way the cottage remains steady despite ongoing pressure. You become aware of the fire again, though it is barely visible now. The embers are so faint that they seem almost internal, as if the hearth itself is remembering warmth rather than actively producing it. Occasionally, a small pulse of orange appears and disappears without clear cause. There is a quiet symbolism in that persistence. The fire does not need to be strong to remain meaningful. Its continuation alone is enough to structure the room. A fragment of rural belief preserved in scattered accounts suggests that embers were sometimes thought of as carrying the spirit of the household night. A poetic idea that reflects how closely fire was tied to domestic identity. While not literal, it expresses the emotional weight placed on continuity and survival. You adjust again on the pallet, and this time the movement feels slower, more deliberate. The straw compresses beneath you in layers that respond gradually rather than immediately. Bedding here is shaped by the repeated use, forming contours that reflect long-term occupancy rather than single nights. The cottage creaks softly as wind pressure shifts. The sound is familiar now, almost reassuring in its predictability. Timber and stone respond together in small adjustments that suggest a structure fully accustomed to the conditions it is facing. Scholarly readings of medieval domestic spaces often highlight the idea that homes were not static environments but adaptive systems, shaped continuously by weather, use, and repair. You can sense that adaptability here in the way nothing feels rigid or fixed. Everything has a degree of flexibility. The air remains thick but stable. Smoke is no longer actively changing the atmosphere. It lingers as part of it. indistinguishable from other scents. Breath, wool, wood, and ash form a single continuous sensory field. You lie still again, and the world narrows further. Sound becomes more distant, perception more diffuse. The boundary between observation and rest continues to blur, and as you remain in this deep, ember-softened quiet where storm, structure, and sleep converge into a single steady rhythm. The cottage holds its fragile balance through the night, sustaining warmth in the smallest possible traces until morning approaches. The cottage is now at its most indistinct hour, where the boundary between night and approaching morning is not visible but gradually felt, like a slow shift in the weight of the air. The fire is nearly gone, reduced to the faintest suggestion of warmth hidden beneath ash. Yet even in this minimal state, it continues to shape the room in subtle ways. You lie on the pallet and become aware of how still everything has grown, not frozen, not rigid, but deeply settled. The kind of stillness that forms after hours of shared survival, when movement is no longer necessary and less demanded by need. Even breathing seems to fall into a softer rhythm, less noticeable, more absorbed into the environment. Outside, the storm has not stopped, but it has changed its texture again. It is now less about force and more about presence. Like a continuous layer laid over the landscape, the wind no longer arrives in sharp bursts. Instead, it moves steadily, wrapping the cottage in an unbroken field of sound that fades in and out of awareness depending on how closely you listen. Inside, the air feels heavier than before, not because it is oppressive, but because it has been fully occupied for so long. Smoke, breath, damp wool, and residual heat have blended into a single atmospheric layer that no longer separates into distinct sensations. It is simply the air of this place, shaped by hours of existence within it. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural domestic environments is the gradual accumulation of warmth and scent within enclosed spaces during long winter nights, without strong ventilation or modern air exchange. Interiors developed a layered sensory identity that persisted until morning. You can feel that accumulation now, as if the cottage itself has absorbed the night and is holding it gently. You shift slightly, and the straw beneath you responds with a faint, dry rustle. The sound feels almost out of place in the surrounding stillness, as if it briefly reminds the room that movement is still possible. Around you, sleepers remain in varied states of rest, though all appear to have settled into deeper phases of sleep. Sleep here does not feel like disappearance. It feels like integration. The bodies in the room are not separate from it. They are part of its thermal and spatial balance. Each person contributes warmth, weight, and presence, helping maintain the internal equilibrium that allows rest to continue. A lesser-known rural observation recorded in some regional accounts describes how households sometimes judge the depth of night by the behaviour of fire remnants, noting how embers would contract into tighter clusters as hours passed. This subtle visual change became a natural indicator of time in environments without artificial measurement. You glance toward the hearth again. The embers are now barely visible, a faint internal glow that seems to exist more as memory than light. Occasionally, a tiny pulse of brightness appears, then fades almost immediately, leaving no trace except a suggestion of warmth. There is something almost reflective in that fading. It does not feel like extinction. It feels like transition, as if the fire is moving into a different state of being within the room. Interpretations of medieval rural nightlife differ among researchers when it comes to sensory perception during extended darkness. Some suggest that low-light environments sharpened attention to sound and temperature changes. Others argue that familiarity reduced sensory stress, allowing inhabitants to interpret darkness as a normal and stable condition rather than something disorienting. Both perspectives acknowledge that night was not experienced as emptiness, but as a structured environment. You begin to notice how your own awareness has adjusted. Small sounds now carry more meaning. The faint shift of timber, the soft movement of air near the floor, the distant pressure of wind against stone all register as part of a coherent system rather than isolated events. The cottage creaks softly again. A slow adjustment in response to wind pressure outside is not a sudden sound. It unfolds gradually, as if the structure is gently repositioning itself rather than reacting. This continuous adaptation gives the impression of resilience, not in a static sense, but in an ongoing, responsive one. A mainstream historical understanding of rural construction in this period highlights that buildings were often maintained continuously rather than rebuilt, with repairs layered over time. Each beam or wall section could represent different moments of restoration. You can feel that layered history in the subtle irregularities of the space around you. The air remains dense but unstable. It no longer changes in noticeable ways. Instead, it holds its composition steadily, as if the night has fully settled into it. Smoke is no longer active. It is simply present, diluted into the environment, indistinguishable from other sensory elements. A curious rural belief preserved in fragments of folklore describes winter nights as times when houses hold their breath, suggesting that structures themselves were thought to enter a state of suspended stillness during extreme cold. While symbolic, it reflects a perception of architecture as something responsive and almost living in its interaction with weather. You can sense that idea in the quiet. The cottage feels paused, not inactive, but stabilized. Everything within it has reached a temporary agreement to remain as it is until conditions change. You adjust your position again, more slowly this time, as if matching the tempo of the room itself. The straw compresses gently, reshaping under weight that has been redistributed many times before. Bedding here is not static. It evolves through repeated use, forming patterns that reflect long-term occupancy. The fire offers one last faint pulse, barely visible, but enough to momentarily define nearby surfaces. For a brief instant, the room regains depth and structure. Then the light withdraws again, leaving only suggestion. Scholarly interpretation varies on whether medieval rural inhabitants experienced night as fragmented awareness or continuous sleep interrupted by environmental demands. Some evidence suggests cyclical rest patterns influenced by fire maintenance and livestock care. Other interpretations emphasize cultural adaptation to extended darkness, where sleep itself was more flexible than modern expectations allow. In either case, night was not a single uninterrupted state. You find yourself existing within that ambiguity now, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, but in a softened middle state where awareness drifts without direction. Outside, the storm continues, though it no longer feels separate from the cottage. It is part of the same system of wind, stone, heat, and breath that defines this entire night. And as you remain in this dim, emberless quiet where structure, sleep, and silence converge into a single steady presence, the cottage holds its balance through the final stretch of darkness, waiting for the slow return of morning light. The cottage is no longer fully in night, but it has not yet reached morning. It exists in a narrow in-between state where darkness has softened rather than disappeared, and the world outside begins to suggest itself again through faint gradients of change in the air. Nothing is clearly visible yet, but everything feels slightly more defined, as if the night itself is loosening its grip. You remain on the pallet, and your awareness feels heavier now, not with discomfort, but with accumulated stillness. Hours of shared warmth, breath, and quiet have settled into the body in a way that makes movement feel unnecessary. Even thoughts seem slower, more layered, as if it must pass through the residue of the night before becoming clear. The hearth is almost completely extinguished. What remains is a low bed of ash with a few dim embers still embedded within it. They no longer cast meaningful light, but they retain a faint presence of heat that spreads outward in subtle gradients. The room is no longer defined by flame. It is defined by what the flame has left behind. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural households is that the final phase of nighttime often involved minimal fire activity to conserve fuel, allowing embers to carry residual warmth until morning tasks could begin. You can feel that strategy embodied here in the way the cottage holds on to its last traces of heat without attempting to renew them. Around you, sleepers begin to shift more noticeably, though still gently. These movements are not abrupt awakenings, but gradual returns to awareness. A hand adjusting a blanket, a slow turn of the head, a deeper breath that suggests sleep giving way to light consciousness. The room is transitioning, not suddenly, but through accumulation of small changes. Outside, the storm has weakened in intensity, though it has not disappeared. The wind still moves across the landscape, but it no longer feels forceful. It has become uneven, broken into softer currents that rise and fall without the earlier sense of pressure. The cottage responds less visibly now. Its structure feels steadier, as if it had passed through the most demanding part of the night. A lesser-known rural observation recorded in some regional accounts describes dawn as a time when houses were believed to release the night slowly, as if the accumulated stillness of darkness dissipated in stages rather than ending abruptly. While metaphorical, it reflects a perceptual shift that aligns with what you're experiencing now. The cottage does not switch from night to morning. It transitions. The air inside feels slightly clearer, not because smoke has disappeared entirely, but because it is no longer being actively reinforced by fire. The lingering scent of ash, wool, and damp earth remains, but it is less dense, more diffused. The atmosphere begins to separate into layers again, rather than existing as a single uniform presence. You notice how sound changes first. The wind outside becomes more distinguishable in direction and variation. Instead of a continuous pressure, it now arrives in uneven flows. Inside, small sounds become easier to identify. A beam settling, a sleeper shifting, the faint rustle of straw. These once blended together are now re-emerging as individual elements. Interpretations of medieval rural daily rhythm suggest that the transition from night to morning was often gradual in lived experience, especially during winter months when daylight increased slowly. There was no sharp division between rest and activity. Instead, households moved through intermediate phases of wakefulness, often beginning the tasks before full daylight arrived. You feel that gradual return happening around you. The cottage is not yet active, but it is no longer fully resting. It exists in a state of preparation, even if no one has fully begun to act yet. A mainstream historical understanding of rural domestic life in this period emphasizes that morning fire renewal was one of the first practical tasks of the day. Rekindling embers or starting a new flame was essential for cooking, warmth, and light. You can sense that necessity approaching in the subtle attention some sleepers now begin to give toward the hearth. The embers are almost invisible now, but they are still there. Occasionally, a faint internal glow appears, barely perceptible, then disappears again into ash. It is enough to suggest continuity, even if not enough to illuminate anything. You shift slightly, and the straw beneath you responds with a soft, dry sound that feels more noticeable than it did earlier. The room is becoming more sensitive to movement. This is part of the transition. Stillness is giving way to readiness. A curious rural belief, preserved in fragments of folklore, describes dawn as the moment when the house exhales, suggesting that structures were thought to release accumulated night energy as morning approached. It is a poetic way of describing what is essentially environmental change, but it reflects how closely people observe the behaviour of their homes across daily cycles. You begin to notice subtle changes in temperature. The air near the floor feels slightly cooler, while areas closer to where the fire once burned still retain faint warmth. These gradients are more noticeable now that the room is no longer dominated by active flame. The cottage begins to feel spatial again in a clearer way. Some sleepers are now partially awake, though not fully engaged. Their movements are slow, unhurried, shaped more by habit than intention. One might adjust a blanket, another might sit briefly before lying back down. There is no urgency yet. The morning has not fully arrived, only suggested itself. Scholarly interpretations of medieval sleep patterns often note that awakening was not always immediate or synchronized. Households tended to transition collectively but loosely, with individuals entering wakefulness at slightly different times depending on role, habit, and environmental cues. You remain still, observing this gradual shift. The cottage feels like it is rediscovering itself piece by piece. The fire area, once the centre of intense focus, is now simply a quiet space waiting to be reactivated. The sleeping areas feel less like enclosed rest zones and more like transitional ground between night and day. Outside, the sky is not yet visible, but its presence is implied through the changing quality of light filtering into the room. Darkness is no longer absolute. It has softened into something more permeable. A well-recorded aspect of rural medieval life is that dawn often began with quiet, practical movements rather than dramatic change. Fire tending, checking animals, and preparing simple tasks were performed before full daylight, reflecting a rhythm shaped by the necessity rather than fixed scheduling. You can feel that rhythm beginning to emerge here, not fully enacted but anticipated. The cottage is preparing itself without urgency. The embers give one final faint pulse, barely visible, as if acknowledging the transition before settling deeper into ash. It is not extinction. It is transformation into stillness that will soon be interrupted by renewal. And as you remain in this soft, shifting threshold between night and morning, the cottage holds its quiet suspension, readying itself for the slow return of light and the first movements of a new day. The cottage is no longer in deep night, and it is not yet fully morning, but something in between has taken hold of the space. The darkness is thinning in a way that is almost imperceptible unless you pay attention, as if the world outside is slowly deciding to reveal itself again. Inside, everything feels calmer, not because anything has changed suddenly, but because the pressure of night has begun to loosen. You are still lying on the pallet, but your awareness is no longer drifting downward into sleep. Instead, it feels like it is rising slightly, not fully awake, but no longer submerged. The cottage is holding that transition with you, sharing the same gradual return to alertness. The hearth is now reduced to a faint scatter of ash and barely glowing embers. They are no longer central to the room in a visual sense, yet they remain important in a different way. They represent continuity, the idea that warmth did not fully vanish during the night. Even this minimal heat changes how the space feels. You notice how the air has shifted. It is still heavy with the remnants of smoke, wool, and human presence, but it feels less compressed than before. There is a slight lifting quality to it, as if the room is slowly exhaling what it held through the night. Nothing is gone, it is simply less concentrated. Records from rural households in the late medieval period suggest that the earliest morning hours were often marked by quiet movement rather than sudden activity. People would begin to stir gradually, tending to fires, checking stored goods, or preparing simple tasks before full daylight arrived. That rhythm is present here now, not as instruction but a behaviour emerging naturally from rest. Around you, sleepers begin to transition in small, uneven ways. One figure shifts more fully, pulling a blanket closer before settling upright for a moment. Another remains still, but with a change in breathing that suggests awareness returning. These are not abrupt awakenings. They are gradual re-entries into the shared space of the cottage. You can sense how the room is reorganizing itself without anyone explicitly directing it. The sleeping arrangements that once felt fixed now appear temporary again, ready to dissolve into daytime activity. The straw pallets, the folded blankets, the uneven spacing between bodies all begin to feel less like sleeping structures and more like pauses in ongoing movement. Outside, the storm has weakened further. The wind still passes across the landscape, but it no longer dominates it. There are intervals of quiet between its movements, and those intervals begin to feel longer. The cottage responds to this change without effort. Its internal sounds become more distinct, no longer masked by constant pressure from outside. A lesser-known rural observation recorded in regional accounts describes the dawn period as a time when houses were said to lighten their breath, a phrase used to capture the idea that enclosed spaces felt less heavy as morning approached. While symbolic, it reflects a real perceptual shift in how interiors were experienced as smoke dissipated and air circulation subtly changed. You notice that shift clearly now. The atmosphere is still enclosed, but it no longer feels sealed. There is a sense of openness returning in small increments. The room is not yet refreshed, but it is no longer fully saturated with night. The embers in the hearth give a faint suggestion of warmth when you move slightly closer. It is not strong enough to define the space, but it is enough to remind you that fire was present here for most of the night. The ash bed is uneven, shaped by repeated adjustments and fading heat patterns. One of the figures near the hearth shifts again, this time more decisively. There is a brief pause, then a slow movement that suggests sitting up fully. The motion is unhurried, as if the body is still negotiating the boundary between sleep and wakefulness. No one speaks yet. The room remains in a quiet transition. Interpretations of medieval domestic life often emphasize that morning activity was closely tied to environmental conditions. Light, temperature, and fire status influence the timing of waking more than fixed schedules. You can see that principle reflected here as awareness spreads unevenly across the room, responding to subtle cues rather than any formal signal. You remain still for a moment longer, observing how the cottage itself seems to participate in this shift. The timber structure creaks lightly, not from strain, but from adjustment as temperatures equalize. Stone retains its coolness, but it no longer feels as dominant as it did during the deepest part of night. A well-recorded aspect of rural construction in this period is the reliance on thermal lag, where thick materials absorb heat slowly and release it gradually over time. This creates a delayed response between external change and internal comfort. You feel that delay now as the cottage retains traces of night warmth, even as outside conditions begin to shift towards morning. The air near the floor feels slightly cooler than before, while higher areas still hold faint warmth. These gradients are more noticeable now that the fire is no longer actively shaping the environment. The room is becoming spatial again in a clearer sense, with temperature and light beginning to define zones rather than a single uniform field. A curious fragment of rural tradition describes dawn as the moment when a household remembers itself, a poetic way of expressing how daily identity reasserts itself after the fragmentation of sleep. While not literal, it reflects how transition from night to day was experienced as a return to structure and purpose. You notice this sense of reassembly in the small movements around you. Someone adjusts their position and begins to gather their belongings. Another reaches toward the hearth area, perhaps checking for remaining heat. These actions are quiet, almost ritual in their repetition. The embers remain barely visible, but they are still present. Occasionally, a faint internal glow appears within the ash, before fading again. It is enough to suggest that fire is not entirely gone, only reduced to its most minimal state. Outside, The sky is no longer entirely dark, though not fully visible. Its presence is implied through a subtle change in ambient light filtering into the room. The cottage is beginning to separate itself from night without a sharp boundary. Scholarly readings of medieval rural rhythm often note that transitions between night and morning were gradual and distributed across multiple household tasks rather than marked by a single moment. Fire tending, animal care, and food preparation all contributed to the slow emergence of daytime structure. You feel that distributed transition now. The cottage is not waking all at once. It is assembling itself piece by piece through small actions and subtle changes in awareness. And as you remain in this quiet, shifting threshold where embers fade and morning begins to form itself gently around the edges of the room, the cottage moves steadily toward daylight, carrying the last traces of night within its walls. The cottage is now fully in the slow arrival of morning, though the light outside is still muted and soft, as if the sky itself is not yet fully awake. The interior reflects this hesitation. It is no longer night, but it has not yet become day in a strong or confident sense. Everything feels suspended in a gentle in-between state. You are still on the pallet, but your awareness has shifted again. It is clearer now, less diffuse, as if the night has loosened its hold on perception. The body feels heavier in a grounded way rather than a drifting one. You're not sinking into sleep anymore. You're returning to presence around you. Movement begins to increase in small practical ways. One figure near the hearth leans forward and gathers ash carefully, feeling for residual heat beneath the surface. Another shifts blankets aside and sits upright for longer, as if testing the temperature of the room before fully committing to wakefulness. These actions are quiet but purposeful. The hearth is now almost entirely ash, only faint traces of heat remain, hidden beneath the surface like something remembered rather than actively present. There is no flame, no glow strong enough to define the space. Yet the hearth still feels like the center of the room, even in its reduced state. Records from rural domestic life in late medieval England indicate that one of the first tasks of the morning was often the renewal of the fire. This was not just practical but essential, as heat, cooking, and light all depended on it. You can sense that anticipation forming now in the subtle attention people give toward the hearth area. The air inside the cottage feels different again. It is lighter than during the deepest part of night, though still carrying traces of smoke and warmth. The density of shared breath and enclosed heat has begun to thin. There is a gradual clearing effect, not dramatic but continuous, like a veil slowly being lifted. You notice how sound has changed as well. The cottage is no longer dominated by the uniform presence of wind and fire. Instead, individual sounds emerge more clearly, a wooden beam settling, the faint rustle of straw being moved, a soft exhale from someone waking fully. These sounds no longer merge into a single background field. They stand apart again. A lesser-known rural observation preserved in regional accounts describes dawn as a time when household sounds were said to separate from one another, meaning that the blended noise of night gave way to distinct, identifiable actions, while metaphorical. It captures the perceptual shift that occurs as awareness returns. You begin to feel that separation yourself. The room is no longer a single continuous experience. It is becoming a collection of individual elements again, each with its own presence and timing. Outside, the storm has diminished significantly. The wind still moves across the countryside, but it no longer dominates the environment. There are visible pauses between gusts, and those pauses allow a sense of openness to emerge. The cottage feels less pressured, as if it is no longer being held in place by external force. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural construction emphasizes that thick walls and thatched roofing were designed not only for insulation, but also for stability during prolonged weather events. These structures did not eliminate environmental influence, but moderated it over time. You experience that moderation now as the cottage feels less reactive and more settled. One of the sleepers near you shifts again, this time more fully, pulling a blanket aside and sitting upright for a longer moment. There is no urgency in the movement. It is gradual, almost cautious, as if the body is reacquainting itself with the room. The transition from sleep to wakefulness is not immediate. It unfolds in stages. The embers remain unchanged, still faintly present beneath ash. Occasionally, a barely visible glow appears, then fades. It is not enough to provide light, but it is enough to confirm continuity. Fire is not gone, it is simply resting in its lowest possible state. Interpretations of medieval rural morning routines often emphasize that household activity was closely tied to fire renewal. Before any significant work could begin, the hearth needed to be brought back to life. This task would often define the true start of the day. You can feel that threshold approaching here. Another figure begins to move more actively, shifting from lying to sitting, then pausing as if listening to the room before acting further. The cottage is slowly filling with intentional motion again. Though still restrained and quiet, you remain in a transitional stillness, observing. The straw beneath you feels slightly cooler than before, now that body heat has begun to disperse and the fire is no longer reinforcing warmth. Yet the room is not cold, it is simply returning to equilibrium with the outside world. A curious fragment of rural tradition describes morning as the moment when a house was said to open its eyes, referring to the gradual increase in light and activity within domestic spaces. While symbolic, it reflects how closely daily life was tied to environmental cues rather than fixed timekeeping. You notice that opening now in the way light filters more clearly into the room. It is still soft and indirect, but it has definition. Shapes are easier to distinguish, the edges of objects are no longer lost in shadow. The cottage is regaining structure through visibility. Someone moves toward the hearth area with deliberate intention, likely preparing to restart the fire. There is a brief pause as materials are gathered, though nothing is yet ignited. The anticipation of flame begins to replace the memory of it. Scholarly interpretations of medieval domestic rhythms suggest that mornings were defined less by sudden change and more by coordinated renewal of essential systems such as fire, food preparation, and household organization. You can sense that coordination beginning to form here in quiet. Overlapping actions. The air continues to clear gradually. Smoke residue becomes less dense, and the mixture of scents begins to separate slightly. Wool, ash, damp wood, and earth are still present, but they are no longer fused into a single heavy atmosphere. Instead, they begin to differentiate again. You shift once more, and the movement feels more natural now, less constrained by the heaviness of night. The body responds more quickly. Awareness is no longer drifting. It is aligning itself with the room. And as the cottage enters this early morning state of gentle reactivation, where embers wait to be renewed and movement begins to gather purpose again, the night fully yields to the slow unfolding of day, holding its final traces only in memory and faint residual warmth. Morning has now properly arrived in the cottage, though it does not do so in a sudden or dramatic way. Instead, it spreads slowly through the room, as if the light itself is cautious about entering too fully. The darkness that once filled every corner has thinned into soft shadow, and the shapes of objects are now clearly readable without effort. You are no longer in that suspended state between sleep and waking. Your awareness is steady now, grounded, and fully present within the space. The palette beneath you feels familiar in a more ordinary way again, no longer part of a drifting nighttime experience, but simply part of a lived environment around you. The cottage is becoming active in small, deliberate ways. Movement is no longer rare or tentative. It is continuous but unhurried, like a household remembering its structure after hours of stillness. Someone near the hearth is already working to rebuild the fire, gathering ash and searching for remaining heat beneath the surface. The hearth itself is almost entirely dormant. What remains of the fire is no longer visible as flame or even glow, but as a faint suggestion of stored warmth in the ash bed. Yet even in this state, it continues to function as the centre of attention. Every movement in the room still orients around it. A well-recorded aspect of rural domestic practice in late medieval England is that the morning fire was essential for restarting daily life. Without it, cooking, heating water, and even basic light were difficult to sustain. The process of rekindling was therefore one of the first coordinated actions of the day. You can feel that necessity shaping the behaviour around you now. As one figure leans closer to the hearth, you notice careful, practiced movements. Ash is gently shifted aside. Small remnants of partially burned material are collected and arranged to encourage airflow. There is no rush. Fire is not treated as something to be forced into existence, but something to be guided back into activity. The air inside the cottage feels noticeably clearer than during the night. Smoke is still present in faint traces, but it no longer dominates the atmosphere. Instead, it lingers lightly, allowing other scents to emerge more distinctly. Damp wood, wool, straw, and stored food each occupy their own subtle space within the environment again. Outside, the storm has largely passed. The wind still moves across the countryside, but it's now irregular and distant. The sense of pressure that defined the night has faded. Through gaps in the structure, a softer brightness suggests the sky is opening into a pale winter morning. A lesser-known rural observation preserved in regional descriptions of daily life suggests that mornings were often marked not by silence, but by a gradual return of distinct household sounds, the rustle of bedding being folded, the scraping of tools, the soft movement of feet across packed earth. You can hear that re-emergence now as sound begins to differentiate again. One of the sleepers has fully risen and is now adjusting clothing near the edge of the room. The motion is slow and methodical, not rushed. Another figure remains seated near the hearth, likely assisting with fire preparation. The cottage is no longer a place of rest. It is becoming a place of activity again, though still in its earliest phase. You shift yourself into a more upright position on the pallet. The straw responds with a muted rustle, and the sensation feels different now that the room is brighter. There is less ambiguity in space, distances are clearer, edges of objects are more defined. The cottage feels more structured again. Interpretations of medieval rural life often emphasize that morning routines were deeply tied to environmental conditions rather than fixed schedules. Light, temperature, and fire readiness dictated the timing of activity. You can see that principle at work here as people respond not to clocks, but to the gradual return of usable daylight and heat. The hearth begins to show the first signs of renewal. A faint wisp of smoke rises as fresh material is introduced. It is not yet a full flame, but it marks the transition from dormancy to activity. That small change shifts the entire tone of the room. The hearth is becoming active again, and with it, the cottage begins to reorganize. A curious fragment of rural tradition describes the first flame of the morning as a moment when the household was said to wake fully, suggesting that fire was seen as the final step in transitioning from night to day. While symbolic, it reflects the practical importance of fire in structuring daily life. You watch as the fire slowly begins to take hold. A small flicker appears, then disappears, then returns more steadily as fuel catches. The process is gradual, requiring attention and adjustment. Nothing about it is immediate. Fire here is something earned through careful handling. Around the room, more movement becomes visible. Bedding is gathered. Containers are opened. Simple tools are checked and repositioned. The cottage is shifting from a resting configuration into a working one. Every object seems to have a role again, no longer paused in sleep. A well-recorded aspect of medieval domestic rhythm is that mornings were often the busiest transition period of the day, as households moved from rest to labour in a coordinated but flexible manner. This transition was not marked by a single event, but by a sequence of small tasks that collectively re-established daily structure. The air continues to improve in clarity. The earlier heaviness has lifted further, leaving a lighter but still earthy atmosphere. The scent of smoke is now intermittent rather than constant. It appears only when the fire shifts or when air moves through the room in certain ways. You become aware of how the cottage feels different in light. Stone surfaces that were once indistinct now show texture and variation. Wooden beams reveal grain and age. Even the straw on the floor appears more detailed, no longer blending into a single surface but forming visible patterns of use. Outside, the sky is brighter now, though still muted by winter cloud. The storm has fully receded into memory rather than presence. The landscape beyond the cottage is likely covered in a thin, even layer of snow, though it is no longer being actively shaped by wind. Scholarly interpretations of medieval rural mornings suggest that the return of daylight was not only practical, but also psychological, marking a renewed sense of order after the unpredictability of night. You can feel that subtle shift in atmosphere as the cottage stabilizes into daytime rhythm. The fire now holds a small but steady flame. It is not large, but it is enough to begin transforming the room again, restoring warmth and providing a focal point for activity. The hearth has returned to its central role, and as you remain in this early morning light, where the cottage is fully reassembling itself through fire, movement, and clarity, the night has fully passed into memory, leaving behind only warmth, structure, and the quiet continuation of daily life. Morning has now fully taken hold of the cottage, not in a sharp or sudden way, but through a steady increase in clarity that transforms everything it touches. The room that once held night as a dense, layered presence is now open to soft daylight filtering through gaps in the structure. The stone walls, timber beams, and worn floor all appear more distinct, as if they have been gently returned to definition after hours of shadowed uncertainty. You are upright now, no longer part of the drifting stillness of sleep. Your awareness feels steady and grounded, shaped by the presence of others moving through the early tasks of the day. The cottage is active again, but in a restrained and familiar way, where every movement serves a purpose tied to survival and routine rather than urgency. The hearth is once again the centre of attention. A small flame has been coaxed back into existence, fragile at first, then slowly strengthening as it finds fuel. It is not yet strong, but it is stable enough to begin restoring warmth and structure to the room. Even this modest fire changes everything. It restores hierarchy to space, drawing attention inward and anchoring activity around it. Records from rural households in late medieval England indicate that the morning fire was often treated as the symbolic and practical beginning of the day. It marked the transition from passive endurance to active labour. You can feel that transition unfolding now as the cottage shifts from rest into function. Around you, people move with quiet coordination. One figure kneels near the hearth, carefully adjusting fuel and airflow to stabilize the flame. Another gathers bedding, folding it with a practiced efficiency. There is no conversation yet, or only fragments of it, spoken softly and without urgency. The sound of work replaces the silence of night in gradual layers. The air inside the cottage feels noticeably different again. It is lighter, clearer, and less saturated with the mixed density of smoke and sleep. The lingering scent of ash remains, but it no longer dominates. Instead, it shares space with the sharper notes of cold morning air drifting in from outside and the faint smell of stored provisions being handled for the day. Outside, the storm has completely passed. What remains is a winter morning that is still, cold, and evenly lit by a pale sky. Snow covers the ground in a smooth, unbroken layer. muting sound and reflecting light back into the cottage through small openings. The world beyond the walls feels open again, no longer pressing inward. A lesser-known rural observation preserved in regional accounts describes mornings after winter storms as times when households measured the world again, referring to the way visibility and clarity returned slowly after hours of enclosed darkness. It captures the sense of reorientation that comes with daylight reasserting structure over space. Inside, that reorientation is visible in small actions. Containers are opened and checked, tools are gathered and inspected, food stores are briefly revisited, not in anxiety but in routine verification. The cottage is not just waking, it is being reorganized for the day ahead. You move slightly through the space, and the floor feels different underfoot now that it's fully lit. The straw, earth, and worn surfaces are more visible, revealing patterns of use that were hidden in darkness. Paths between sleeping areas, hearth, and storage are now clearly defined. The cottage has a geography again. Interpretations of medieval rural daily life often emphasize how closely work patterns were tied to environmental conditions. Light determined activity more than fixed scheduling, especially in winter months. You can see that principle in how movement begins here as soon as visibility improves and fire stabilizes. The hearth flame grows slightly stronger, no longer just a fragile spark but a consistent source of heat. Its presence begins to reorganize the room once again, pulling attention and activity toward it. Even in its modest state, it is enough to restore a sense of order. A curious fragment of rural tradition suggests that the first stable flame of the morning was sometimes regarded as a sign of household continuity, representing survival through the night, while symbolic. It reflects the central importance of fire in daily structure. Without it, the rhythm of the household would not fully resume. You notice how sound has changed again. The cottage is no longer defined by wind and silence, but by layered activity. The soft scraping of objects being moved, the faint crackle of fire, occasional footsteps across packed earth. These sounds no longer merge into background noise. They exist as distinct elements of morning life. Scholarly interpretations of medieval domestic rhythm suggest that morning activity was distributed rather than centralized, with multiple tasks beginning simultaneously across different parts of the household. Fire tending, cleaning, preparation of food, and care for animals often occurred in overlapping sequences rather than strict order. You can sense that distribution here as the cottage begins to function as a coordinated system again. No single action dominates. Instead, multiple small actions build together into the structure of the day. The air continues to clear further. The heaviness of night has fully dissipated, leaving a cleaner but still hold interior atmosphere. The transition is not only sensory but spatial. The room feels larger now that it's fully visible, as if light has expanded its boundaries. Outside, the snow reflects daylight evenly, creating a quiet brightness that filters into the cottage through gaps in the walls and roof. The world beyond feels stable and unchanged, but newly accessible again after the enclosure of night. A well-recorded aspect of medieval rural life is that mornings often involved immediate engagement with both domestic and environmental conditions. Households would assess weather, tend fires, and prepare food simultaneously, reflecting a rhythm shaped by necessity rather than separation of tasks. You observe this rhythm unfolding now. The cottage is not segmented into distinct activities. It is functioning as a single interconnected environment where fire, movement, and preparation occur together. The hearth now burns steadily, though still modestly. Its warmth is enough to define the central area of the room again. Drawing people into its orbit is no longer just surviving the night, it's actively supporting the beginning of the day. And as you remain in this quiet morning state where light, fire, and movement have fully returned to structure the cottage once more, The long night has completely dissolved into memory, leaving only the steady continuation of daily life. Morning has fully claimed the cottage now, not in any dramatic arrival, but in the steady certainty of light that no longer hesitates at the edges of the room. The stone walls, once softened by darkness, are now fully legible in their age and texture. Timber beams show their grain clearly, and the floor reveals every uneven path worn by years of movement. The cottage is no longer a place suspended in night. It is a working space again, shaped by light, sound, and purpose. You stand among it all with a sense of quiet completion, as if you have travelled through something without ever leaving the room. The body feels grounded now, no longer drifting between sleep and awareness. Every sound is clearer, every movement more deliberate. The night has not simply ended, it has been folded into memory, still present in sensation but no longer active in the environment. The hearth is alive again with a steady, practical flame. It is no longer fragile or uncertain, it burns with intention. Supported by fresh fuel and careful tending, smoke rises in a more controlled line, finding its way through the roof opening with less resistance than before. The room responds immediately. Warmth spreads outward in soft gradients, restoring the familiar structure of domestic space. Records from rural households in late medieval England describe this moment of morning renewal as one of the most essential transitions in daily life. Fire was not just comfort, it was function, enabling cooking, warmth, light, and the organisation of labour. Without it, the household remained incomplete. You can feel that logic embedded in the way attention gathers around the hearth again, as if the entire cottage is remembering its purpose. Around you, movement is now steady and coordinated. Bedding is fully gathered and stacked. Containers are opened with intent. Simple tools are brought out and inspected for the day's use. There is no rush, but there is direction. The cottage has shifted from endurance into activity, and that shift feels complete and stable. Outside, the winter morning is clear and still. Snow lies evenly across the landscape, reflecting pale light back into the room. The storm that defined the night is gone, leaving only a quiet atmosphere that feels expansive compared to the enclosed intensity of darkness. The world beyond the walls is visible again, open and calm. A lesser-known rural observation preserved in regional accounts describes mornings after heavy winter nights as moments when households reclaimed the distance, referring to the return of visible horizons after hours of enclosed darkness and sound. It reflects how deeply weather could shape perception of space itself. You can sense that reclamation now as the outside world becomes fully present again. Inside, the air continues to clear. The dense layering of smoke, breath, and sleep has lifted significantly. What remains is a clean but cold atmosphere that is gradually being warmed by the hearth. The sensory field is no longer compressed. It is open, structured, and distinct. You move through the cottage and notice how fully it has reassembled itself into functional space. Sleeping areas are no longer separate from activity zones. They are simply part of a larger interior landscape that is already transitioning into work. The hearth anchors everything, as it always does, but now it supports motion rather than rest. Interpretations of medieval rural life often emphasize how deeply morning routines were tied to environmental cycles. Light, temperature, and fire determined the structure of the day more than any fixed schedule. You see this clearly in how every action here responds directly to conditions rather than timekeeping. The fire burns steadily now, producing a consistent glow that restores depth to the room. Shadows return, but they are softer and more controlled than during the night. They no longer obscure, they define. The cottage feels fully present in both light and form. A curious fragment of rural tradition suggests that the first fully stable fire of the morning was sometimes seen as a sign that the household had successfully carried the night through. a symbolic recognition of survival and continuity. While not literal, it reflects the importance of fire as a marker of endurance. You notice how that sense of continuity feels present in the room. Nothing here has been reset. Everything has simply transitioned forward. The same structure that held night now holds day, adjusted but unchanged in essence. Scholarly interpretations of medieval domestic rhythm highlight that mornings were periods of distributed activity rather than centralized focus. Multiple tasks begin at once, overlapping and reinforcing each other. Fire tending, preparation of food, cleaning, and planning for labor all occur within the same early window of time. You can feel that distributed rhythm taking shape around you. The cottage is no longer resting or waking, it is functioning as a system, each part contributing to a shared continuity of daily life. Outside, the snow reflects steady daylight, and the horizon feels stable and distant. There is no storm left to interpret, no pressure against the structure. The environment is calm, and that calmness allows attention to expand and outward again. A well-recorded aspect of rural medieval life is that winter mornings often required immediate engagement with both domestic and environmental tasks, from fire maintenance to checking stored provisions and assessing weather conditions. These actions were not separate from living, they were living itself. You observe that integration here as the household moves naturally from rest into activity without clear division. The cottage does not switch states, it flows between them. The hearth remains central, but its role has changed. It is no longer preserving night, it is enabling day. Its flame is steady, reliable, and small enough to be controlled but strong enough to support the room's needs. Everything in the cottage now orients around its presence in a fully active way, and as you remain in this final moment of transition, when night has fully dissolved and morning has settled into structure, the cottage stands complete in its daily renewal, carrying forward the quiet continuity of life within stone, fire and winter light, sweet dreams,